There is a country at the bottom of the world that has been keeping secrets for a very long time. Not small secrets. Not the kind of secrets that get resolved after a few years and a decent investigation. The kind of secrets that sit inside court files that have never been fully opened. Inside old newspaper archives that most people have never thought to look through. Inside the memories of families who still do not have answers, decades after the questions first arrived. Australia is the sixth largest country on the planet by total land area. It covers almost 8 million square kilometers. It contains some of the oldest geological formations on Earth. Some of its rocks are 4 billion years old, older than the moon. And within that landscape, within that enormous, sunburned, ancient, weathered country, human beings have been disappearing and encountering things they could not explain, and leaving behind evidence that has stumped scientists and detectives and governments and researchers for generations. This is not a list of ghost stories. This is not folklore dressed up as history. Everything you're about to hear tonight is documented. Every case has files. Every mystery has investigators who spent years trying to crack it open. Some of them came close. Some of them got answers that only produced more questions. And some of them simply walked away because the evidence pointed somewhere that made no logical sense, and they had no framework to contain what they had found. Tonight we're going through 25 of them. 25 cases from across the full breadth of the Australian continent and its surrounding waters. Cases from the deserts of South Australia and the rainforest coast of Queensland and the deep south of Tasmania and the red dirt cattle country of the Northern Territory and the beaches of New South Wales where families used to go on Sunday afternoons to eat fish and chips and let the children run free. We're going to spend time with each one. We are not going to rush. The whole point of tonight is that you settle in and you let the stories breathe, and you follow each one all the way to wherever it ends. Some of them end with a revelation that will genuinely surprise you. Some of them end with a theory that is more unsettling than the mystery itself ever was. And some of them simply end at the edge of what is knowable, which is sometimes the most honest place a story can finish. You should know, before we begin, that Australia has a particular relationship with disappearance. It is baked into the geography. The interior of the continent is one of the most unforgiving environments on the surface of the planet. People go out there and do not come back. That has been true for as long as Europeans have been attempting to cross it, and it was true in different ways for the 65,000 years before that. The land does not give things up easily. It does not surrender its dead, or its evidence, or its explanations without considerable effort on the part of whoever is doing the asking. But what makes these 25 cases different from simple disappearances in difficult terrain is that most of them did not happen in the interior. Many of them happened on busy beaches in the middle of summer, in city apartments, on sealed roads with other drivers nearby, at the edge of suburban cricket grounds, in the full daylight of an ordinary Tuesday morning with witnesses and footprints and physical evidence everywhere. And still, somehow nobody has ever been able to fully explain what happened. That is the thing about Australia's mysteries. They are not mysterious because there is no evidence. They are mysterious because the evidence refuses to assemble itself into a clean answer. Pieces fit in some places, and then they absolutely do not fit in others. Witnesses saw things that the physical record contradicts. Physical evidence points to explanations that the witness testimony eliminates. Investigators arrive at conclusions that later investigators completely overturn, and the families in every single case are still waiting. The continent is 3,000 kilometers from north to south. It is 4,000 kilometers from east to west. It has been continuously inhabited for longer than any other place on Earth currently inhabited by modern humans. It has coastline that runs for over 34,000 kilometers if you trace every inlet and bay and headland. And somewhere along all of that coastline, somewhere across all of that interior, somewhere inside all of that history, the answers to these 25 questions are sitting quietly, waiting to be found. We have time tonight. Let us go looking. Before we go any further, I want to say something quickly, and then we will get straight back into it. If this kind of content is what you come here for, if you find yourself settling in for a long night with a case you have never heard of, or a story that has been nagging at you for years, if you are the kind of person who reads the last footnote of a Wikipedia article at 2 in the morning, and then checks the sources, and then opens 6 more tabs, then you're exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Subscribe if you have not already. It means a great deal more than it probably sounds like it does. And leave a comment when you're done, or even halfway through. Tell me which mystery is sitting with you the most. Tell me where you are in the world tonight. That is always one of the best parts of doing this. Now, let us begin. Number 1. The Man on Somerton Beach and the Message Nobody Has Ever Decoded. On the morning of the 1st of December 1948, a man was found dead on Somerton Beach in South Australia. That sentence seems straightforward. A man, a beach, a death, but almost nothing else about this case has been straightforward in the 76 years since it happened. The man on Somerton Beach has become one of the most studied, most debated, most genuinely puzzling forensic mysteries in Australian history, and possibly in the history of criminal investigation anywhere in the world. He was well dressed. That was the first thing people noticed. He was lying on the beach with his head resting against the seawall at the southern end of Somerton Beach, his legs extended, his feet pointed outward, his arms resting by his sides in a position that looked almost deliberately arranged. He was wearing a white shirt with a collar and a tie. His trousers were well pressed. His shoes were clean and polished. His jacket was neat. For a man found dead on a public beach in December in Adelaide, he was extraordinarily well turned out. He was also carrying no identification whatsoever. No wallet, no cards, no letters, no papers. Nothing with a name on it. Nothing that would tell anyone who he was or where he had come from. The labels inside his clothing had been removed, all of them. Deliberately, carefully removed from every single garment he was wearing. Not torn, not fallen out. Cut or picked out cleanly by someone who wanted to make sure that nothing with a name or a manufacturer's mark remained on the body. This was immediately understood to be unusual. People do not typically remove clothing labels before going to the beach. People do not typically die on beaches in the early morning with their shoes clean and their tie straight and their wallet missing. Police understood from the beginning that this was not a simple case. The autopsy produced more puzzles than answers. The pathologist found evidence of congestion in the brain and other organs consistent with poisoning, but no poison was found. The stomach contained food consistent with a pasty eaten 3 to 4 hours before death. The heart showed signs of stress. The cause of death was listed eventually as heart failure, but the pathologist himself stated clearly that he believed the man had been poisoned with something that either had not yet been identified or had metabolized out of the body before the examination. The cause of death was never definitively established. That has never changed. Then, in January of 1949, a suitcase was found at the Adelaide railway station in a clocked bag storage area. It had been left there on the 30th of November 1948, the day before the man was found. The contents of the suitcase were consistent with the clothing found on the body in terms of quality and condition. A dressing gown, slippers, pajamas, a pair of trousers with sand in the cuffs, a shirt, a screwdriver and a table knife, and a pair of scissors and a stenciling brush. Again, all labels removed. Again, no name, nothing traceable. Sewn into the lining of the trousers found in the suitcase, investigators found a small rolled piece of paper. On it were 2 words printed in tiny type. Tamam shud, Persian for it is ended. The scrap had been torn from the final page of a rare edition of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a 12th century Persian poem cycle. Not a common book, not something you would typically find in your coat pocket, an uncommon edition at that. The Rubaiyat in this particular form had only been printed a handful of times. The book was eventually found. Someone had handed it in to police saying it had appeared in the back seat of their unlocked car the previous year. In the back cover of that book, someone had written in pencil a sequence of letters in 5 lines, not words, not a message in any obvious language, a code. Cryptanalysts at the highest levels of Australian intelligence, and later researchers from multiple universities across multiple decades, have studied that code. Nobody has conclusively deciphered it. It may be a one-time pad cipher, which would make it essentially impossible to crack without the corresponding pad. It may be an acrostic of some kind. It may be something else entirely. And then there was the woman. A phone number found near the code led investigators to a nurse living in Glenelg, not far from Somerton Beach. She recognized the dead man. She had possessed a copy of the same rare edition of the Rubaiyat years earlier, and she had given it to a man she knew, a man named Alfred Boxall. Police found Boxall. He was alive. He still had his copy of the book. The woman's connection to the dead man was therefore completely unclear. She was questioned but maintained throughout her life that she did not know who he was. She became visibly distressed when shown the plaster cast of his face. She refused to discuss the case further. She took whatever she knew to her grave. He was buried in West Terrace Cemetery in Adelaide. For decades, the Somerton man, as he came to be known, remained unidentified. And then, in 2022, a forensic genealogist named Colleen Fitzpatrick and her team used DNA extracted from the man's preserved hair, combined with family tree research, to produce a probable identification. Carl Webb, an electrical engineer and instrument maker from Melbourne, born in 1905, a man who had been married and had a child, and at some point vanished from the ordinary record of his life. The identification has not been formally confirmed by Australian authorities as of this telling, and the family connection to the nurse, if any exists, remains unconfirmed. What nobody has explained is why he died, what he was doing in Adelaide, why his clothing was labelled so carefully, what the code means, whether he was a spy, which many researchers believe, or simply a deeply private man who chose to disappear. The manner of his death still points toward poisoning with a substance that may have been deliberately untraceable. If that is true, then someone killed him, and nobody has ever been charged. Carl Webb, or the Somerton Man, or whatever name is written in the code that nobody can read. He is still there in the cemetery. The questions are still there with him. Number 2, the 3 children who walked into the summer and never came back. Australia Day, 1966. The 26th of January, a national public holiday. The beach at Glenelg, just south of Adelaide, was crowded. It was the middle of summer. The water was bright and the sand was warm, and families were spread across the beach in the way that Australian families have always spread themselves across beaches on public holidays, with towels and picnic bags, and children running everywhere underfoot. The Beaumont family arrived at Glenelg Beach that morning by bus. The parents, Jim and Nancy Beaumont, were not with them. This was not unusual for the era. In 1966, children in Australian suburbs regularly caught buses on their own, spent days at the beach unsupervised, and were expected home at a certain time. The oldest child was 9 years old. Her name was Jane. The middle child was 7 years old. His name was Anna. The youngest was 4 years old. Her name was Grant. 3 children. The oldest 9. The youngest 4. They took the bus to Glenelg Beach on a hot summer morning, and they never came home. Jim and Nancy Beaumont waited at their house in Somerton Park that afternoon. The bus that should have brought the children home came and went, and then another bus, and then another. When the children had not arrived by 5 in the afternoon, Jim Beaumont went to the beach himself to look for them. He found nothing. He contacted police that evening. The search began. What investigators pieced together from witnesses at the beach was both reassuring and deeply alarming. Multiple people had seen the 3 children that day. A postman named Tom Patterson had seen them playing in the water with a man in the late morning. The children appeared happy, not distressed, not frightened, playing with this man as though they knew him or had at least been comfortable enough with him to be in the water and laughing. The man was described consistently by multiple witnesses. Tall, blonde or fair-haired, perhaps 30 years old, athletic build. He had been seen buying the children food at a local shop. He had been seen with them on the beach for several hours. One witness said the children had seemed to treat him almost as a father figure. Easy, natural, like someone they trusted. After that, nothing. The children were not seen again, ever. Not in 1966, not in 1967, not in the decades of searching that followed. No bodies were found, no physical evidence connected to them was recovered. No credible confirmed sighting was ever made after that Tuesday morning at Glenelg Beach. The investigation became one of the largest in South Australian history. The description of the blonde man was circulated nationally. Thousands of people were interviewed, psychics were consulted, hypnotists were used to try to recover more detailed descriptions from witnesses. A former Dutch psychic named Gerard Croiset came to Australia twice and claimed to be able to locate the bodies in specific locations. He was wrong both times. The bodies were never found. In 2013, a businessman named Hayden Phipps died. He had, in the 1990s and again later, been named by his own mother as a possible suspect. His mother had apparently told investigators that her son had acted strangely after the disappearance, and that she believed he had been responsible. Phipps had always denied involvement. When he died, investigators obtained a warrant to excavate a property in Castleroy, a factory site that had been connected to a lead provided by a retired detective. They found nothing. The age progression images of Jane, Anna, and Grant Beaumont have been updated multiple times over the decades. Jane would be in her late 60s now. Anna in his mid-60s, Grant in her early 60s. If they are alive, they would be old. If they are alive, they have lived their entire lives without their family, without an explanation, without anyone who loves them knowing where they are. Jim Beaumont died in 1995, still not knowing what had happened to his children. Nancy Beaumont died in 2019. She was 86 years old. She had been asked about her children in interviews for over 50 years. She never stopped hoping. She never stopped believing that someone knew something that they had not said. Her last public statement was a request. If you know anything, please tell us. Nobody told her. She died without an answer. The case has never been closed. South Australia police maintain it as an active investigation. The blonde man at the beach has never been identified. The children's bodies have never been found. And on every 26th of January, on the anniversary of the day they walked down to the bus stop and disappeared into the summer, their names are still spoken. Jane, Anna, Grant, in that order, always, the way their mother said them. Number 3. The pilot who called in a UFO and then vanished from the sky. On the evening of the 21st of October 1978, a 20-year-old pilot named Frederick Valentich took off from Moorabbin Airport in Melbourne in a single-engine Cessna 182. He was flying to King Island in Bass Strait, a crossing of about 270 kilometers over open water. The flight was routine, the weather was clear, the visibility was good. Frederick Valentich was not yet a highly experienced pilot, but he was trained and he had made crossings like this before. He never arrived at King Island. What makes the Valentich disappearance different from almost every other aviation mystery in Australian history is what was recorded in the minutes before it happened. Frederick Valentich was in radio contact with Melbourne Air Traffic Control throughout the flight. The controller on duty that evening was Steve Roby. What Roby recorded over the final 17 minutes of the flight became the most discussed piece of audio in the history of Australian aviation, and it has never been fully explained. At approximately 7:10 in the evening, Valentich contacted Melbourne Air Traffic Control and asked if there was any known traffic in his area below 5,000 feet. He was flying at 4,500 feet. Control confirmed there was no known traffic in his area. Valentich then said something that immediately changed the tone of the communication. He said there was an aircraft flying over him. He said it was not a small aircraft. He said it had 4 bright landing lights and was moving very fast. Control again confirmed there was no known traffic in his area. Valentich then reported that the aircraft had passed over him at about 1,000 feet above. He said it was approaching from the east. He described it as metallic and shining. He said it was moving at speed. Control asked him to confirm the type of aircraft. Valentich said he could not identify it. He said it was orbiting on top of him. He said it was not an aircraft. He used those specific words. It is not an aircraft. Over the following minutes, Valentich described the object moving away from him, then coming back, then hovering. He said the aircraft, or whatever it was, had a long green light and the shape was rough. He sounded calm, or as calm as the situation would allow. He was trying to describe what he was seeing clearly and precisely the way a pilot would, using the vocabulary of aviation and observation. He was not panicking, he was reporting. And then, at 7:12 and 28 seconds, Valentich said one more thing. He said his engine was rough and was coughing. He said he was going to proceed to King Island. The final thing he said was an unfinished sentence. He said, "Melbourne, that strange aircraft is hovering on top of me again." And then there was a metallic scraping sound. 17 seconds of it, and then nothing. The Cessna and Frederick Valentich were never found. The search that followed was one of the most extensive air and sea searches in Bass Strait history. Aircraft and ships covered enormous areas of the water between the Australian mainland and King Island. Not a single piece of wreckage was recovered. Not a fuel slick, not a seat cushion, not a piece of the aircraft's frame. Nothing that could be confirmed as belonging to the Cessna or to the man who was flying it. The explanations that have been offered over the years form an interesting inventory of what the human mind reaches for when it encounters something it cannot categorize. One explanation is that Valentich became disoriented in the dark and flew inverted without realizing, mistaking his own aircraft's lights for another object above him, and then crashed into the sea. This explanation requires accepting that the aircraft then sank completely without leaving debris, which is possible but unusual in shallow-based strait waters. It also requires ignoring the radio transcript somewhat aggressively. Another explanation is that he staged his own disappearance, that he had prepared false documentation, landed on a private airstrip, and began a new life somewhere. No evidence of this has ever been found. No one matching his description with a false name was ever located. His family never received any contact. The explanation that a significant portion of researchers in this case find least dismissible is the one that the transcript suggests most directly, which is that Valentich encountered something in the air above him, that, whatever it was, interfered with his aircraft's systems, and that the outcome was not a crash in any conventional sense. A photograph taken near Cape Otway that same evening by a local man shows an object in the sky. It is not a known aircraft. It was not explained by aviation authorities. Frederick Valentich was 20 years old. He had told friends before the flight that he believed in unidentified aerial phenomena. He had told his father that if he ever encountered a UFO while flying, he would radio it in. He did exactly that. He kept his word. And whatever happened to him in the sky above Bass Strait on that October evening took him completely, leaving nothing behind, not even the residue of an answer. Number 4. The woman in the pajamas and the identity nobody could solve for a decade. On the 1st of September 1934, a body was found on the bank of the Murrumbidgee River near Albury in New South Wales. It had been wrapped in a bag. The woman inside the bag had been murdered. She was young, perhaps in her mid-20s. She had dark wavy hair. She was wearing yellow silk pajamas. She had been beaten. Her face had been burned, presumably to delay identification. Her fingerprints had been deliberately obscured. Whoever had killed this woman had taken very significant steps to prevent her from ever being identified. And for a long time, those steps worked. The pajama girl, as she came to be known in the press, was unidentified for 10 years. 10 years, she was preserved in formaldehyde at Sydney University and displayed periodically to members of the public and to police in hopes that someone would recognize her. Hundreds of people came forward with identifications. None of them were confirmed. The case dragged on through the late 1930s and into the 1940s with no resolution and growing pressure on the New South Wales police to close it. In 1944, a man named Antonio Agostini was arrested. He was an Italian-born waiter living in Melbourne. Police alleged that the pajama girl was his wife, Linda Agostini, a British-born woman who had gone missing in 1934. Antonio Agostini eventually confessed. He said that Linda had attacked him, that there had been a struggle, and that she had been accidentally shot. He said he had panicked and disposed of the body in the way that was found. He was convicted of manslaughter, served 6 years, and was deported to Italy in 1950. The problem is that numerous people who had known Linda Agostini well stated clearly that the pajama girl was not Linda. A coroner had examined the body in 1938 and concluded it was probably not Linda Agostini. The dental records did not perfectly align. Photographs of Linda compared to the preserved body produced genuine uncertainty. Several investigators over the following decades argued that the identification was politically motivated, that New South Wales police wanted the case closed after 10 embarrassing years, and that an imperfect match to a missing woman was considered good enough. If that is true, then the pajama girl has never been identified. She is still, underneath the 1944 closure, an unknown woman found on a riverbank in yellow silk pajamas, killed by someone who went to enormous lengths to ensure nobody ever knew who she was. If Antonio Agostini's confession was obtained under pressure and referred to someone who was not the actual victim, then Linda Agostini may also still be unidentified in some form, and her actual killer has never faced any consequences at all. The case was reviewed multiple times in subsequent decades. DNA testing was not available in 1944. By the time it was, the preserved remains had been through enough handling and environmental exposure that the results were complicated. No definitive DNA confirmation of the Linda Agostini identification has been publicly confirmed. The file is closed, but the questions are not. Number 5, the Prime Minister who went swimming and was never seen again. On the 17th of December 1967, the Prime Minister of Australia, Harold Holt, went for a swim at Cheviot Beach near Portsea on the Mornington Peninsula in Victoria. The sea was rough, the swell was running 2 to 3 meters. His companions, who included a mix of friends and security personnel, urged him not to enter the water. The conditions were too dangerous. Harold Holt was 59 years old and he went in anyway. He was seen swimming for a short distance, and then he was gone. Harold Holt was the 17th Prime Minister of Australia. He had been in office since January 1966. He was a popular figure, known for his love of the sea and his considerable physical confidence in the water. He was an experienced diver and swimmer. His decision to enter those particular conditions on that particular day has never been adequately explained. Those who were with him said he simply walked into the surf and disappeared. There was no cry for help, no sign of distress. He was there, and then he was not. The search that followed was massive. It involved Royal Australian Navy divers, Army personnel, and civilian boats. It covered extensive areas of coastline and water. No body was found, no remains. Nothing attributable to Harold Holt has ever been recovered from Cheviot Beach or its surrounding waters. The absence of a body created the conditions for speculation, and the speculation has been extraordinary in its range and creativity. The theory that received the most international attention was put forward by an Australian journalist named Anthony Gray in a 1983 book. Gray argued that Harold Holt had been a Chinese intelligence asset for decades, and that on the day of his disappearance, a Chinese submarine had surfaced near Cheviot Beach and taken him aboard. China, in this account, had been running Holt as a deep cover operative since the 1930s, and December 1967 was his extraction. This theory is almost universally dismissed by historians. The idea that the Prime Minister of Australia, a staunch US ally who had famously said Australia would go all the way with LBJ in support of the Vietnam War, was simultaneously a Chinese spy is difficult to square with the available evidence of his actual policy record and personal history. The more prosaic and widely accepted explanation is that Holt drowned. The sea at Cheviot Beach was genuinely dangerous that day. Strong currents and heavy swell have claimed experienced swimmers in those waters before and since. His body may simply have been carried far out to sea and never recovered, which does happen. A coronial inquest held in 2005 officially found that Holt had drowned. His death was formally registered in 1967, 7 years after the disappearance itself. But the absence of a body has kept the questions alive in a way that a confirmed drowning never would have. He simply walked into the sea in front of witnesses and was swallowed by it, the Prime Minister of a nation, gone in the middle of summer, leaving behind a country that did not know how to grieve something it could not confirm. A public memorial service was held. No funeral, there was nothing to bury. His widow, Zara Holt, eventually had a memorial plaque placed at the site. Cheviot Beach is now occasionally called Harold Holt Memorial Reserve, which is either a touching tribute or a rather austere irony, depending on your disposition toward the Pacific Ocean, on a rough December afternoon. Number 6, the farmer who saw a craft land in his paddock and left a nest behind. On the 19th of January 1966, a banana farmer named George Pedley was driving a tractor through his property at Horseshoe Lagoon near Tully in far north Queensland. It was early morning. Pedley was 28 years old and had been farming in the region for several years. He knew the land well and he knew its sounds. What he heard that morning was not a sound the land usually made. He described it later as a loud hissing, like air being released from a tire, but much louder, much larger, coming from the direction of the lagoon. He turned his tractor and drove toward the sound. What he saw, rising from the surface of Horseshoe Lagoon, was something he spent the rest of his life trying to describe accurately, an object, disc-shaped, about 9 meters across and between 3 and 4 meters high. It was rotating and ascending steeply at high speed. He watched it climb and accelerate away into the sky. From the moment he first saw it to the moment it disappeared took only seconds. When he reached the lagoon and looked at the water where the object had been, he found something that no one involved in the subsequent investigation ever fully explained: a circular area of flattened reeds approximately 9 meters in diameter. The reeds had been pushed down in a clockwise radial pattern from the center outward, as though something heavy and rotating had rested on them and then lifted. They were in no way randomly disturbed. They were precisely arranged. The pattern was deliberate and mechanical. Local authorities were contacted. The RAF, the Royal Australian Air Force, sent officers to examine the site. Scientists from the CSIRO came. Botanists studied the reed patterns. The physical evidence was documented extensively. The official explanations offered included waterspout, dust devil, and a natural phenomenon related to gas rising from the lagoon floor. None of these explanations adequately accounted for the precise mechanical pattern of the flattened reeds, or for Pedley's testimony, or for the fact that the shape and size of the flattened area was consistent with what Pedley described seeing hovering above it. Tully is significant in the history of what later came to be called crop circles, because this event predates the English crop circle phenomenon by 15 years. The first widely publicized English crop circles appeared in the late 1970s and became a cultural phenomenon in the 1980s. Whatever appeared at Horseshoe Lagoon in January 1966 was not influenced by that later cultural moment. George Pedley had never heard of crop circles. He was simply a banana farmer who drove his tractor toward a noise and found something that changed the texture of his life permanently. He reported what he saw honestly and consistently for decades. He did not sensationalize it. He did not claim to have been taken aboard anything or to have had contact of any kind. He said he saw an object rise from the water and fly away, and he found a circular depression in the reeds where it had been. He said this, reliably and without embellishment, for the rest of his life. The Tully saucer nest, as it came to be called, remains unexplained. The RAF investigation produced no conclusion. The site was visited by researchers from around the world in the years that followed. The lagoon is still there. George Pedley died in 2009. Whatever he saw that January morning in 1966 went with him, except for the part it left behind in the water, which nobody's ever been able to fully account for. Number 7. the tiger that was declared dead and has refused to stay that way. On the 7th of September 1936, a thylacine died in captivity at the Hobart Zoo. Its name was Benjamin, though that name was given to it retrospectively, and there is some question about whether the zoo staff called it that at the time. It was, as far as anyone knew, the last of its kind on Earth, the last Tasmanian tiger, the last survivor of a species that had once ranged across the entire Australian continent and into New Guinea, reduced by human hunting and habitat clearing to a remnant population on Tasmania, and then, finally, to this single animal in a zoo enclosure in Hobart, which died on a September night when a keeper accidentally left it locked out of its sleeping quarters in weather that dropped below what it could survive. The species was officially declared extinct by the Tasmanian government in 1936. In 1982, it was formally listed as extinct under the Endangered Species Act. In 1986, the IUCN, the International Authority on Species Status, listed it as extinct. Officially, scientifically, legally, the thylacine is gone. The thylacine is also, according to a substantial and persistent body of eyewitness testimony that has continued for 88 years since Benjamin died, still out there. The number of reported sightings of the Tasmanian tiger since 1936 is genuinely remarkable. By some counts, credible reported sightings in Tasmania alone number in the thousands across the following decades. Sightings have also been reported on the Australian mainland, particularly in remote areas of Queensland and Western Australia. The quality of these reports varies enormously. Some are brief glimpses in headlights on bush roads at night that could be attributed to other animals. Some are sustained observations by experienced naturalists and wildlife researchers who know the Australian fauna well and who describe with considerable precision an animal that matches the thalacine's distinctive profile: the stiff kangaroo-like tail, the striped lower back, the wide jaw, the unusual gait. In 1973, the National Parks and Wildlife Service of Tasmania received a report from a wildlife ranger who said he had clearly observed a thylacine at close range in the remote southwest of the state. He had been in the field for years and was specific in his identification. In 1982, a wildlife officer named Hans Narding spent 3 minutes observing an animal by torchlight that he reported with absolute confidence as a thylacine. He was less than 6 meters from it. He had a camera in the vehicle but could not reach it without disturbing the animal. He watched it for 3 minutes before it disappeared into the scrub. Since the early 2000s, the quality of potential evidence has improved significantly with the advent of trail cameras and remote sensing technology. Various programs have deployed hundreds of cameras in remote Tasmanian wilderness. In 2016, 2 Queensland scientists released footage from a remote area of Cape York Peninsula that they assessed was consistent with a thylacine, though other researchers suggested it showed a qual. The debate about that footage has not been fully resolved. In 2022, the University of Melbourne announced a collaborative project with Colossal Biosciences, a biotechnology company, aimed at using CRISPR gene editing technology to restore the thylacine through its closest living relative, the fat-tailed dunner. The project attracted significant scientific criticism and significant public fascination. The researchers involved acknowledged that even if they successfully created an animal with thylacine-like traits, it would not be genetically identical to the original species. But they argued that restoring an apex predator to Tasmanian ecosystems would have measurable conservation benefits. What is interesting about the de-extinction project from the perspective of this story is that it assumes the animal is gone. Researchers engaged in that project proceed on the basis that the last thylacine died in Hobart in 1936. But if Hans Narding spent 3 minutes watching a thylacine in Tasmanian bushland in 1982, the premise of the project is incorrect. The species would not need to be rebuilt. It would need to be found. The Tasmanian wilderness is vast. The southwest of the state contains some of the most remote and inaccessible terrain in Australia. A small breeding population of thylacines could plausibly survive in that country for decades without leaving evidence that cameras or researchers would be positioned to find. The mathematics of concealment in truly remote wilderness are more favorable than most people appreciate. The thylacine is extinct. The thylacine has also been reliably reported by credible witnesses in multiple states of Australia in every decade since its official extinction. Both things sit in the same space. The answer is somewhere in the wilderness, in the way that so many Australian answers are, sitting in a place that is simply too large and too quiet for certainty to reach it. Number 8. The thing in the scrub that 70,000 people claim to have seen. Australia has its own version of Bigfoot. It is older than the American Bigfoot tradition, which received its name in 1958. It predates the Himalayan Yeti in terms of documented Western colonial encounter reports, and it exists within Aboriginal oral tradition under various names across the continent for tens of thousands of years before European arrival. It is called the Yowie. The Yowie is described consistently across a very wide geographic range and a very long time period, large, bipedal, covered in dark hair or fur, standing between 2 and 3 meters tall, sometimes reported taller, wide shoulders, long arms that hang lower than a human's. A face described variously as ape-like, gorilla-like, or as something that does not quite match any known primate. An extremely powerful smell, described as musky or rotting or simply overwhelming, mentioned in the majority of close encounter reports. A sound described as a deep, resonant bellowing or screaming, unlike anything else in the Australian fauna. Sightings have been reported from every Australian state and territory, from the Blue Mountains of New South Wales, which have the highest concentration of modern reports, from the rainforest country of southeast Queensland, from the remote ranges of Western Australia, from the Snowy Mountains, from the Otway Ranges of Victoria, from Tasmania. The number of people who have reported an encounter with something they identified as a yowie runs into the tens of thousands. Many of these reports are from people who know the Australian bush well: farmers, loggers, park rangers, experienced bushwalkers. People who can identify a kangaroo from a wallaby from a wombat from 50 meters in dim light. People who know the sounds their bush makes and the shapes that belong in it, who say that what they encountered was emphatically none of those things. The most serious systematic effort to document and investigate Yowie reports has been carried out for decades by researchers, including Dean Harrison, who has collected thousands of detailed reports and has himself had what he describes as a direct encounter in southeast Queensland in the late 1990s. His account and the accounts he has collected include physical evidence in some cases, footprints significantly larger than any known Australian mammal, tree branches broken at heights inconsistent with other known animals, ground disturbances consistent with a very large biped. The Yowie has never been photographed convincingly. No physical specimen has been recovered. No skeleton or significant bone material has been confirmed as belonging to an unknown primate. These facts sit alongside the testimony in a way that is genuinely difficult to resolve, because they should be incompatible, and yet here we are, with thousands of people describing a consistent entity over 2 centuries of European observation, and presumably much longer in Aboriginal tradition, and no confirmed physical evidence. The Aboriginal connection deserves particular attention. The Yowie, or entities matching its description, appear in the oral traditions of dozens of Aboriginal groups under different names: the Yuri in some Kamilaroi traditions, the Jurawara and Mingawin in other groups. These are not simple folktale creatures. They are described as real, physical beings that inhabit specific landscapes and behave in specific ways. They are described with the specificity that characterizes accounts of real animals, not mythological ones. Aboriginal people across the continent, for tens of thousands of years, have been telling their descendants about an entity matching what non-Indigenous Australians started reporting in the 19th century. What exactly it is, if it exists, is an open question. Australia did have giant megafauna, including large primates in its prehistoric past, though Gigantopithecus, the enormous prehistoric ape, was primarily an Asian genus. If a remnant population of a large primate has survived in remote Australian wilderness, the implications for what we know about Australian zoo geography are significant. If the accounts are misidentification of known animals, the consistency of the descriptions across so many independent observers in such different places and times requires an explanation of its own. The bush keeps its secrets. Australia is very good at keeping things hidden in plain wilderness. The Yowie is either the most successfully cryptic large mammal on the planet, or it is something else entirely, a cultural and psychological phenomenon of extraordinary persistence that generates consistent, detailed, multi-sensory false experiences in tens of thousands of people across 2 centuries. Neither explanation is entirely comfortable. Number 9. The stone structure on the hill that should not exist. On the outskirts of Gympie in southeast Queensland, on a hill known locally as Rocky Ridge, there is a stepped stone structure that has been the subject of controversy, investigation, and considerable academic discomfort since the 1970s. It is constructed from large blocks of sandstone arranged in terrace levels ascending the hillside. It is not a naturally occurring formation. It was built by someone. The question that has generated the controversy is, by whom? The mainstream academic position is that the structure is a product of 19th century European settlement activity, perhaps a garden terrace built by early farmers, perhaps a dry stone walling project from the colonial era, perhaps several different things built at different times that have been misidentified as a single ancient structure. This position is consistent with the lack of any documented pre-colonial European presence in the region, and with the absence of any formal archaeological excavation that has definitively dated the structure to a pre-colonial period. The alternative position, argued most prominently in recent decades by researchers outside academic archaeology, is that the Gympie Pyramid is evidence of pre-European contact with the Australian continent. The specific claim varies. Some argue the structure is of ancient Egyptian origin, pointing to what they interpret as hieroglyphic carvings found in the area. Some argue it is Phoenician, some have proposed a connection to the ancient civilizations of Southeast Asia. The presence of what appears to be a carved figure that some researchers have compared to the Hindu god Ganesha, found in the region in the 19th century, has added a further strand to the non-mainstream argument. The mainstream response to these claims has been consistent and pointed. The structure has not been formally and comprehensively excavated. Carved figures found by private individuals in the region in the 19th century have no confirmed provenance. The supposed hieroglyphs have been assessed by Egyptologists as non-Egyptian. The absence of rigorous archaeological dating has allowed the speculation to continue in the absence of data that would settle the question. What is genuinely interesting and rarely discussed in either the mainstream dismissal or the alternative advocacy, is a series of Aboriginal oral traditions collected from local Gubbi people in the 19th and early 20th centuries that refer to the structure on the hill as ancient and as predating European settlement. These accounts describe the structure as having been there for as long as anyone could remember, which, in an oral tradition with deep historical reach, is not a trivial statement. A proper full excavation of the Gympie structure has never been completed. The hill is on private property, access has been controlled, and various ownership changes have complicated formal research. What would be found under a systematic excavation with proper dating methods is not known, because no one has done it. That is the actual mystery of the Gympie Pyramid, not what it was built by, which may have an entirely ordinary explanation. The mystery is why it has never been properly excavated. Why, in a country with active and well-funded archaeology, a contested stone structure of uncertain age on a Queensland hillside has been studied insufficiently to allow anyone to say with certainty when it was built, by whom, and for what purpose. The hill is still there. The stones are still arranged on it. And the answer is sitting in the soil beneath them, waiting for someone to look. Number 10. The ship made of mahogany. Buried in a sand dune that would rewrite history. If the mahogany ship exists, and is what some researchers believe it to be, it is one of the most historically significant finds in Australian archaeology. If it is definitively proven, it would place a European vessel on the southwest coast of Victoria more than a century before the Dutch navigator Dirk Hartog made his documented contact with the Australian coast in 1616. It would overturn the established timeline of European knowledge of the continent. It would require a substantial revision of the history of exploration. That is why the mahogany ship matters. And that is why the fact that it has never been conclusively found, despite being reported by hundreds of witnesses across more than a century and a half, is one of the most enduring puzzles in Australian historical research. The first documented European reports of a wrecked vessel buried in the sand dunes near Warrnambool in southwestern Victoria appear in the 1840s. 3 sealers named Smith, Wilson, and Grice reported sighting the wreck of a large vessel protruding from a dune near the Warrnambool coast in 1836. They described the timber as dark and hard and dense, unlike the Baltic pine typically used in European vessels of that era. They described a style of construction that seemed old and unfamiliar. Their report was documented and circulated. Over the following decades, dozens of additional reports came from people who claimed to have seen the same wreck or a wreck matching its description. All of them located it within a broadly consistent stretch of coastline near Warrnambool. All of them described dark, hard timber. Many described a style of construction consistent with a caravel, the type of vessel used by Portuguese explorers in the early 16th century. Several described decorated timbers and carved elements. The Portuguese connection is what gives the mahogany ship its historical charge. It is known from Portuguese documents that Portuguese explorers were active in Southeast Asian waters from the early 16th century onward, and that their geographical knowledge extended further south and east than is often acknowledged. Several historians have argued that a Portuguese vessel reached the Australian coast in the 1520s, which would make the mahogany ship a physical remnant of that contact. The problem is the sand. The Warrnambool coastline is one of the most dynamic and shifting stretches of coastline in Victoria. Dune systems there migrate and reform with seasonal wind patterns. A wreck embedded in those dunes would be buried deeper in some decades, exposed briefly in others, and then buried again. The pattern of historical sightings is consistent with a wreck that was periodically exposed during years of specific wind and weather conditions, and then covered again. Systematic searches of the dune system using ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing technology have been conducted multiple times, most comprehensively in the 1980s, and again in subsequent decades. Some anomalies have been identified below the sand surface in the relevant area. None of them have been excavated in a way that has produced confirmed wreck material. The mahogany ship is either sitting in the dunes near Warrnambool, waiting for a combination of weather and technology and funding to reveal it, or it is a collective misidentification that 2 centuries of witnesses have perpetuated from faulty original reports. The historical stakes of the first possibility are enormous. The simplicity of the second is intellectually unsatisfying given the sheer weight of consistent testimony. Either way, the dunes at Warrnambool are keeping something. The sand gives nothing up unless the wind decides it is time. Number 11. The lost gold reef that men have died trying to find for over a century. Lewis Hubert Lassiter claimed to have found a vast gold-bearing reef in the Australian desert in 1897 when he was 17 years old. He claimed it was somewhere in the Gibson Desert or the McDonnell Ranges region of Central Australia. He said he had found it accidentally while lost and near death in the desert, that he had marked it and taken samples, and that he had been unable to return to it for over 30 years because he could not get anyone to believe him and could not fund an expedition on his own. In 1930, Lassiter finally convinced a group of investors and the newly formed Central Australian Gold Exploration Company that his reef was real. An expedition was organized. 7 men set out from Alice Springs in August of 1930 with vehicles and supplies, and Lassiter as the guide to what he claimed was a reef of gold so rich that a single exposure could be seen from a considerable distance. A reef many kilometers long with extraordinary surface gold content. The expedition was a disaster almost from the start. The vehicles broke down repeatedly. The terrain was beyond what the equipment could handle. The men ran out of fuel and supplies at various points. Lassiter quarreled bitterly with the other members of the party. One by one, the other members of the expedition turned back. Lassiter continued alone with 2 Afghan cameleers, who eventually also left him. He was found months later by a missionary in the desert, in terrible condition, with his camels gone and his supplies exhausted. He died in January of 1931 at a location in the desert that took years to properly confirm. He left behind a diary. The diary is one of the most studied documents in Australian frontier history, partly because of what it might reveal about the location of the reef, and partly because of the question it raises about whether Lassiter himself was a tragic visionary or an elaborate fraud, who led men into one of the most dangerous environments on Earth based on a story he had invented. The reef has been searched for by dozens of expeditions since 1931. No confirmed discovery has been made. The geological surveys of the region Lassiter described have not identified a formation consistent with his accounts of surface visible gold of that magnitude. Some geologists have argued that a reef of the size Lassiter described simply does not exist in the areas he indicated, that the geology is inconsistent with such a formation. There is, however, an equally important body of research suggesting that Lassiter's 1897 journey, though extraordinary for a 17-year-old, may be consistent with documented records of a young man named Harold Bell Lassiter, who was in roughly the right part of Australia at roughly the right time, and who disappeared from records for a period consistent with a desert ordeal. Lassiter's reef sits in the Australian imagination in a particular place, alongside other great unresolved promises of the frontier. It is either a reef that has not yet been found, or it is the most elaborately maintained geographical fantasy in Australian history. 125 years of searching has not produced a definitive answer either way. The desert is large. The desert also does not give up its gold easily, or its dead, or its secrets. Number 12. 211 people, 1 ship and 0 wreckage. The SS Waratah was a passenger and cargo steamship that disappeared somewhere in the waters off the east coast of South Africa in July of 1909 on a voyage from Durban to Cape Town. It was carrying 211 passengers and crew. It was never seen again. No wreckage was recovered, no bodies, no debris, no cargo, nothing. That is correct. A ship carrying 211 people vanished from a stretch of ocean and left no trace. The Waratah was operated by the Blue Anchor Line and was on her second voyage after being built in Glasgow in 1908. She was a large vessel by the standards of the day, almost 12,000 tons, considered reliable and well appointed. She was carrying passengers between Australia and Britain with a South African stop, a regular and well-established route. Concerns about the Waratah's stability had actually been raised before she disappeared. A civil engineer named Claude Sawyer had travelled on the Waratah on the outbound leg of the journey and had become so alarmed about what he perceived as the ship's unusual rolling behaviour and moderate swell that he disembarked in Durban rather than continue to Cape Town. He sent a telegram to the Blue Anchor Line's London office warning that the vessel was unseaworthy. He later described a recurring nightmare he had had during the voyage about a man dressed in armor holding a bloody sword, a dream he took as a premonition. Sawyer disembarked. The Waratah continued. On the 27th of July 1909, the Waratah was last seen by another vessel, the Clan McIntyre, off the Natal coast. The weather in that region over the following days was severe. Gales and heavy seas were recorded. Multiple ships in the area experienced difficult conditions. The search conducted after the Waratah was reported overdue was extensive for 1909. Ships were diverted to search the relevant stretch of ocean. The South African coastline was examined. No trace was found. A commission of inquiry held in London in 1910 concluded that the Waratah had capsized in heavy weather, possibly as a result of the stability issues that Claude Sawyer had observed. The inquiry could not determine the precise location or circumstances of the sinking. What makes this case particularly extraordinary, beyond the complete absence of any wreckage from a large and relatively modern steel vessel, is that the waters off the South African east coast have been searched multiple times in subsequent decades, using modern technology specifically for the Waratah's remains. In 1999, a search team using side-scan sonar identified a large object on the seafloor off the Bashi River in South Africa. A subsequent dive found it to be a rock formation. Other anomalies identified by remote sensing have similarly not produced a confirmed wreck. 211 people, a ship that met an unknown fate in known waters and left nothing behind that anyone has been able to find. The ocean off South Africa is not Australia, but the Waratah was an Australian-operated vessel, carrying Australian passengers on an Australian route, and the families of those passengers were spread across Australia waiting for news that never came, and a body of water that offered nothing in return. It remains one of the greatest maritime mysteries of the 20th century. Every few years, someone announces they are going to find the Waratah. They go out, they come back, the ocean keeps its counsel. Number 13. The two deaths by the river that make no chemical sense. On the 1st of January 1963, two bodies were found on the bank of the Lane Cove River in a suburb of Sydney called Chatswood. They were discovered at first light in a peaceful riverside area that was well known as a place for picnicking and walking. The bodies were those of a man and a woman, both of whom had been at a New Year's Eve party in the suburb the previous evening. The man was Dr. Gilbert Bogle, a research scientist at the CSIRO, one of Australia's most distinguished scientific research institutions. He was 38 years old and had a young family. He was well regarded professionally and had been described by colleagues as brilliant. The woman was Mrs. Margaret Chandler, the wife of one of Bogle's acquaintances. She was 29 years old. She also had young children. The cause of death of both Gilbert Bogle and Margaret Chandler was never established. That sentence needs to sit for a moment. Two people died on a riverbank in Sydney on New Year's Day 1963. Autopsies were performed, chemical analysis was conducted, and no cause of death was ever confirmed. The pathologist could not identify what killed them. The investigation became one of the longest-running and most scrutinized murder inquiries in New South Wales history. The police investigation at the time produced enormous amounts of speculation, but no charges. The circumstances of the party the night before, and the various relationships and tensions among those who had attended, were examined in detail. The idea that Bogle and Chandler had been poisoned was widely considered. What poison could have produced the observed symptoms and then metabolized or evaporated without leaving detectable traces in 1963 forensic analysis was not established. In 2006, New South Wales Police reopened the investigation and engaged Dr. Peter Griffiths, a forensic toxicologist, to conduct a new analysis of preserved tissue samples from both bodies using modern analytical techniques. Griffiths concluded that the most probable cause of death was hydrogen sulfide poisoning. Hydrogen sulfide is a naturally occurring gas that can build up in riverbank sediments, particularly in areas with poor water quality and heavy organic decomposition. He argued that in 1963, the Lane Cove River in that area was heavily polluted with industrial waste and organic matter, and that the concentration of hydrogen sulfide gas in the sediments could have produced a toxic cloud at ground level sufficient to incapacitate and kill 2 people lying on the bank. This explanation, if correct, means that Bogle and Chandler were not murdered. It means they died accidentally from a natural but lethal gas release from polluted riverbank sediment. It is a conclusion that removes the sinister element from the case entirely. The problem is that not everyone accepts it. Some researchers have pointed out that the hydrogen sulfide hypothesis requires a very precise set of conditions to produce a lethal concentration at exactly the right time and place, and that other people in the vicinity of the river that night did not become ill. Some former investigators have continued to maintain that the deaths had a human cause. No one has been charged with anything. The coroner's finding from the original inquest that the cause of death was unknown was never formally updated after the 2006 analysis. Gilbert Bogle and Margaret Chandler are buried in different cemeteries in Sydney. The Lane Cove River is cleaner now than it was in 1963. Whatever killed them, whether gas from a polluted riverbed or something more deliberate and human, has never been established to the satisfaction of everyone who has studied the case. The 2 families spent decades without answers. That is not a small thing to carry. Number 14. The murders at Wanda Beach that nobody has ever solved. On the 11th of January 1965, 2 15-year-old girls named Christine Sharrock and Marianne Schmidt were murdered at Wanda Beach on the Cronulla Strip in Sydney's south. They had travelled to the beach from their homes in the western suburbs for a day out with Marianne's 4 younger siblings. The younger children were left on the beach, while Christine and Marianne walked to a quieter area of the dunes. The younger children waited. The girls did not return. Their bodies were found in the dunes that afternoon. They had been assaulted and killed. The manner of death was violent. The girls were found close together. New South Wales police launched one of the largest criminal investigations in Australian history to that point. Thousands of people at Cronulla Beach and surrounding beaches that day were interviewed. Thousands of follow-up investigations were conducted. Artists' impressions were circulated based on descriptions of a man seen in the area. The investigation consumed enormous resources over many years. Nobody was ever charged. Nobody was ever definitively identified as responsible. The case remains officially unsolved. In 1990, a man named Alan Bassett, who had been a suspect in the original investigation, was publicly identified in connection with the murders, but the evidence against him was circumstantial and he died in 2000 without being charged. In 2000, New South Wales police cold case detectives reviewed the file again. DNA samples had been taken from evidence at the scene, but the DNA technology of 2000 was not sufficient to produce a usable profile from the degraded material. In 2013, using significantly improved DNA analysis techniques, New South Wales police announced that they had extracted a partial male DNA profile from material recovered from the original crime scene. This profile was entered into the National Criminal Database. It has not, as of the most recent public update, produced a database match. Christine Sharrock and Marianne Schmidt were 15 years old. They had taken the train out to the beach to spend a day at the water. Marianne was looking after her younger siblings. The image of those 4 younger children sitting on the beach, waiting for the 2 older girls to come back, is one of the most terrible images in the long record of unsolved crimes in Australia. Their families have been waiting for 60 years. The DNA profile sits in a database. The file remains open. The beach is still there, busy and ordinary on summer days, carrying its history quietly below the surface of salt wind and sunscreen and ordinary human life. Number 15. The house in the country town that threw stones at itself for 3 months. In 1921, in the small town of Guyra in the New England region of New South Wales, a house began throwing stones at itself. That is the most accurate way to describe what happened. Rocks and stones struck the exterior of the house repeatedly, sometimes hundreds of times in a single evening. They came from directions that witnesses said did not contain anyone capable of throwing them. They struck the house at angles that seemed to defy the geometry of the surrounding land. The house was occupied by a family named Bowen. The Bowen family had several children, the youngest of whom was 11 years old. The stone throwing began in early April 1921 and continued with increasing intensity for approximately 3 months. What makes this case remarkable in the history of Australian paranormal investigation is not just the stone throwing, which could theoretically have been produced by a human agency willing to persist in an elaborate hoax for 3 months, but the response that the events generated from the New South Wales police. Police officers were assigned to the Bowen House for extended periods to observe and investigate. They watched the stones arrive. They watched them come from directions they could not explain. They conducted thorough searches of the surrounding property during the events and found no person who could have been responsible. A police detective named Inspector Carroll spent time at the house and submitted a formal report stating that he had witnessed stones striking the house from directions that he could not account for through any conventional means. He was not a man given to easy credulity. His report to his superiors was taken seriously enough that the investigation continued at official expense for several months. Investigators from outside the police also visited. A Melbourne journalist named H.J. Rumsey spent several nights at the house and wrote a detailed account of what he observed that included stones arriving at speed and at unexpected angles, pebbles falling inside the house in a room with no open windows, and at least one occasion when a stone appeared to travel a short distance and then change direction in a way he could not reconcile with normal projectile physics. The poltergeist hypothesis, which is essentially the hypothesis that some unknown force associated with one or more of the occupants of the house was producing the phenomenon, was discussed at the time. The focus on the youngest child, the 11-year-old, was consistent with the historical pattern of poltergeist reports, which often involve adolescence or pre-adolescence. Whether there is any scientific substance to the poltergeist hypothesis, or whether it is simply a label for a phenomenon that is not understood, is a question that remains genuinely open. The stone throwing at the Bowen house stopped in mid-1921 as suddenly as it had started. The police withdrew. The family remained in the house. The town of Guyra returned to its normal life. The investigation produced no conclusion. The police report described events that were observed and could not be explained and left it at that, which is at least an honest ending, if not a satisfying one. The Bowen house is gone now. Guyra is still there, a small country town in the New England tablelands. The 1921 file is in the New South Wales State Archives. Anyone who wants to read a police inspector's careful, professional account of watching stones fall from an empty sky can go and read it. It will not make things any clearer, but it is worth reading. Number 16. The British backpacker on the Stuart Highway and the man who was finally caught. On the 14th of July, 2001, a 28-year-old British man named Peter Falconio and his 27-year-old girlfriend, Joanne Lees, were driving along the Stuart Highway in the Northern Territory, heading north in a VW Combi van. It was late at night. The Stuart Highway between Alice Springs and Darwin is one of the most isolated roads in Australia. Hundreds of kilometers of single-lane bitumen through flat, dark desert with very little traffic. A man pulled alongside them in a utility vehicle and flagged them down. He indicated there was a problem with their exhaust. Peter Falconio got out to look. What happened next was described by Joanne Lees in a statement that has been examined and re-examined for over 2 decades, and remains, in its essential outline, the only first-hand account of what occurred on that stretch of highway. Joanne Lees said she heard a bang. She said the man appeared at her window with a gun. She said she was tied with her hands behind her back and a cord placed around her neck. She said she was put in the utility vehicle. She said she managed to escape when the man went back to the combi, that she ran into the bush and hid in scrub for over 5 hours while the man searched for her with a dog, and that she finally emerged after she believed he had left and was found by truck drivers. Peter Falconio was not there. His body has never been found. His blood was found on the road surface, a significant quantity of it, consistent with a serious wound. He has not been seen or heard from since that night on the Stuart Highway. A man named Bradley John Murdoch was identified through a complex chain of forensic and witness evidence, and was charged with Falconio's murder and with the assault and deprivation of liberty of Joanne Lees. He was convicted in December 2005 and sentenced to life imprisonment. The DNA evidence against Murdoch included a profile recovered from a cable tie used to bind Joanne Lees' wrists that was a match to him. Bradley Murdoch has maintained his innocence throughout his imprisonment. He has continued to appeal and to seek review of his conviction on multiple grounds. He has alleged that Joanne Lees' account is fabricated and that the forensic evidence was contaminated or mishandled. His supporters, who are not numerous but are persistent, have raised questions about specific aspects of the prosecution evidence. Peter Falconio's body has never been found. Without a body, there is no confirmed location of death, no confirmed manner of death, and no confirmed evidence that he is actually dead rather than alive somewhere under a different identity, which has been proposed by some commentators as an alternative to the murder theory. This alternative is considered implausible by the vast majority of investigators and researchers who have looked at the case, but the absence of a body makes it technically unresolvable. The Stewart Highway is long and dark and largely empty in the hours after midnight. Whatever happened to Peter Falconio in those hours happened in a place where there was no one to see, no camera to record, no record to examine. The conviction of Bradley Murdoch rests on the evidence available. What happened in the specific moments between the bang Joanne Lees heard and the moment she escaped into the dark desert is known only to the people who were present. One of them is in prison, one of them is living her life in Britain, and one of them, if Murdoch is correctly convicted, is somewhere in the desert soil of the Northern Territory, returned to the earth of a country that was not his own. Number 17. The family car that was lifted off the road in the dark. On the 20th of January 1988, a family of 5 was driving along the Nullarbor Plain in Western Australia in the early hours of the morning. The family's name was Knowles. Faye Knowles was driving with her 3 adult sons, Patrick, Sean, and Wayne. They were traveling from Perth toward Adelaide on the Eyre Highway, one of the longest and most isolated stretches of highway in Australia. At around 4 in the morning, the family reported seeing a bright light ahead of them on the road. As they approached, the light appeared to be an object sitting on or hovering above the road surface. What happened next is what makes this account exceptional in the Australian record of unexplained encounters. Faye Knowles described the car being lifted, not pushed, not hit, lifted. She described the vehicle rising off the road surface and then being slammed back down hard enough to blow out a tire. She described a black substance entering the car through the windows. She described a smell described variously as electrical burning and decayed matter. She described a sound associated with the object that she compared to a slowing down tape recording, a deepening distortion of normal sound. The family pulled over, changed the tire, and drove to the nearest roadhouse at Mundrabilla. They reported the experience to other travelers and to staff. Their account was consistent across all 4 members of the family when they were separately questioned. A truck driver who had been on the same stretch of road that morning, Hank Hessler, reported seeing an unusual light on the highway. Another truck driver reported a similar sighting from that night. Physical evidence was examined. The car's roof had impressions consistent with what Faye Knowles described. There was a substance on the exterior of the vehicle and inside the car that was submitted for analysis. The analysis of this substance has been disputed, and the results have never been publicly confirmed definitively. The tire that blew out was consistent with an impact rather than a simple puncture. The Nullarbor Plain is one of the most remote and flat stretches of terrain in Australia. Thousands of square kilometers of low scrubland above one of the world's largest limestone karst systems. It is a place where, if you're on the highway at 4 in the morning, you are genuinely alone. There are no towns, no lights on the horizon, no ambient noise beyond the engine and the wind. The Knowles family's account has been assessed by researchers across the spectrum, from complete dismissal to serious consideration. The physical evidence is ambiguous. The consistency of the family's testimony under separate questioning is noted by researchers who take the case seriously. The corroboration from the truck drivers is partial but present. Whatever the family encountered on the Nullarbor that January morning in 1988, and whatever it was that caused their car to shake and their tire to blow, and left impressions on their roof and a substance in their seats, the Australian government has never offered an explanation. The file exists. The police report is documented. And the Eyre Highway runs the same straight line across the same flat country today that it did in 1988, in the same darkness, carrying the same absence of certainty about what travels alongside ordinary vehicles in the hours before dawn. Number 18. The woman whose ship sank and who survived the unimaginable. In May of 1836, a ship called the Stirling Castle ran aground on a reef in the Coral Sea off the Queensland coast. The vessel was wrecked. Most of those aboard managed to reach shore on the wreck's longboat. The survivors found themselves on the Queensland coast in the vicinity of what is now called Fraser Island, one of the world's largest sand islands, covered in dense rainforest with no European settlement within hundreds of kilometers. Among the survivors was the captain's wife, a Scottish woman named Eliza Fraser. What happened to Eliza Fraser and the other survivors over the following weeks is one of the most contested narratives in Australian history. The standard account, which Eliza Fraser told repeatedly in the years following the ordeal, is that the survivors were taken in by the local Butchulla Aboriginal people, that some of the survivors, including her husband Captain Fraser, died during the period of captivity, that she was separated from the others and subjected to various ordeals, and that she was eventually rescued after approximately 6 weeks by a former convict named John Graham, who had been living with the Butchulla people and who guided her to safety. This narrative was published and republished in various forms, and became one of the most widely read Australian stories of the 19th century. It influenced literature and art, most famously Patrick White's 1976 novel, A Fringe of Leaves. It provided the template for a particular colonial narrative about the dangers of the Australian interior and the alleged savagery of the Aboriginal peoples who lived there. The problem with Eliza Fraser's account, which historians began examining seriously in the second half of the 20th century, is that it appears to have changed significantly between the original events and the published versions. In the earliest documented accounts, the Butchulla people are described as providing food and some care to the survivors. In later versions, the story became progressively more dramatic and the actions of the Aboriginal people progressively more violent. Historians have suggested that Eliza Fraser, who subsequently made money exhibiting herself and telling her story in England, had strong financial incentives to produce the most dramatic version possible. The Butchulla people's own oral traditions of the same events describe something quite different. Their account describes the survivors being welcomed and provided with food and assistance. They describe the death of Captain Fraser as resulting from his existing injuries, rather than from any action by the Butchulla people. They describe Eliza Fraser's behavior during the period she was among them as erratic and at times difficult to manage. The truth of what happened on that island in 1836, what Eliza Fraser experienced and what the Butchulla people did, has been argued by historians for decades without resolution. What is clear is that a woman survived a shipwreck and 6 weeks in a remote and challenging environment, and that whatever happened during those weeks, whether ordeal or sanctuary or some complex mixture of both, was subsequently reshaped into a narrative that served colonial purposes and caused lasting harm to the reputation of the Butchulla people. Fraser Island is now called K'gari, its Butchulla name, following a formal renaming in 2021. The island is one of the most beautiful places in Australia. The story of what happened on it in 1836 is still being told in different versions by different people for different reasons, and the full truth of it is in the same place as so many Australian truths, in the oral tradition of a people who were not asked for a long time and who have not been fully listened to even when they finally were. Number 19. The Rock That a Novel Made Famous and the Real Mystery Nobody Discusses. Picnic at Hanging Rock is one of the most celebrated Australian novels and films ever produced. Joan Lindsay published the novel in 1967. Peter Weir directed the film adaptation in 1975. The story involves a group of schoolgirls and a teacher who go on a Valentine's Day excursion to the volcanic rock formation called Hanging Rock in central Victoria, some of whom disappear and are never found. For many years after the publication of the novel, a significant number of readers believed it was based on a true event. The book was presented with a preface that deliberately blurred the line between fact and fiction. Lindsay herself was ambiguous in interviews. The sense that the events were real was carefully cultivated, and it was effective. Generations of Australian readers grew up believing that children had actually disappeared at Hanging Rock in 1900. They had not. The disappearances in the novel are entirely fictional. Joan Lindsay invented them. There is no historical record of anyone going missing at Hanging Rock on Valentine's Day 1900 or at any other time. The Victorian historical archives for that period contain no account of a search or an investigation of any such events. The local newspapers from that era, which would certainly have covered such a story, contain nothing. This is widely known now. Joan Lindsay's authorship of a fictionalized event is publicly acknowledged. The Hanging Rock tourism industry, which is substantial, is upfront about this. What is less discussed is that Hanging Rock, the actual geological formation, does have a genuinely strange quality that is not easy to dismiss as atmosphere or tourist mythology. It is a volcanic plug, the solidified lava core of an ancient volcano, which rose through the surrounding landscape over thousands of years as the softer rock eroded away. It is covered in rock stacks and crevices and narrow passages, many of which are genuinely difficult to navigate safely, and some of which descend into cavities that have not been fully mapped. The electromagnetic properties of volcanic rock in general, and of this formation in particular, have been discussed in relation to the disorienting effect that some visitors report. Compass anomalies have been documented in the area. Some researchers who study the relationship between geological formations and unusual reported experiences have pointed to Hanging Rock as an example of a site where the rock's electromagnetic signature may produce effects on human perception and orientation. Whether or not that explanation accounts for anything is genuinely debatable. What is not debatable is that Hanging Rock, the real one, is an unusual place. People do lose their orientation there. The formation is more complex and more labyrinthine than it appears from a distance. Joan Lindsay spent considerable time at the site before writing her novel, and she chose it deliberately, not randomly. The fiction is acknowledged. But the strangeness underneath the fiction, the quality of that particular rock in that particular valley that made a writer want to set a disappearance story there and made readers around the world believe it immediately, that part is real. And it has never been explained in terms that feel entirely adequate to the experience of standing at the base of those rocks in the early morning, when the mist is still in the valley and the light is coming in sideways. Some places are simply like that. And the mystery of why they are like that is not less real because the specific events attributed to them are fictional. Number 20. The insect that was found alive on an island stack after being declared extinct. This one is different from the others on this list. It is not a human mystery. There are no missing persons, no coded messages, no unexplained lights. But it is, in its way, one of the most astonishing stories in Australian natural history. And it belongs here because it demonstrates something important about the limits of certainty when it comes to the Australian wilderness. Lord Howe Island is a small volcanic island in the Tasman Sea, about 600 kilometres east of Port Macquarie in New South Wales. It is one of the most remote inhabited places in Australia, and nearby it, rising from the ocean, is a single volcanic sea stack called Ball's Pyramid. Ball's Pyramid is the world's tallest sea stack at 562 meters. It is a sheer volcanic needle rising from the Tasman Sea, almost entirely bare rock, with no fresh water, almost no soil, almost no vegetation beyond a small patch of Melaleuca shrubs near the base on one side. The Lord Howe Island stick insect, known scientifically as Dryocoxylus australis, was once common on Lord Howe Island. When black rats arrived on the island via a grounded supply ship in 1918, they devastated the stick insect population. By 1930, the species was considered extinct on Lord Howe Island. By the 1960s, it was considered extinct everywhere. In 2001, a group of Australian scientists and rangers climbed Ball's Pyramid specifically to look for evidence of the stick insect, based on reported sightings by rock climbers who had been on the stack in previous years. What they found underneath the single clump of Melaleuca shrubs was a small population of large, black, lobster-like stick insects. 24 individuals, 24, on a bare volcanic stack in the middle of the Tasman Sea. A species that had been considered extinct for decades was alive and feeding on the leaves of a single small shrub. The implications were immediate. A captive breeding program was established using a small number of individuals. The Melbourne Zoo took on the primary responsibility for the breeding effort, and as of recent years, the program has produced thousands of captive bred individuals. The question of reintroducing them to Lord Howe Island has been complicated by the ongoing presence of rats on the island, a problem that a sustained rat eradication program has been working to address. What this case reveals is the degree to which the vastness and inaccessibility of certain Australian environments means that declared extinctions and declared absences should be held with a degree of intellectual humility. If 24 individuals of a large insect species can survive for 80 years undetected on a sea stack that human beings can only access by technical climbing, what else might be surviving in places that are similarly inaccessible? The thylacine. The question asks itself. Ball's Pyramid still stands in the Tasman Sea. The stick insects are still there, on whatever descendants of the Melaleuca shrubs provided them refuge for 8 decades. It is a story about survival in the most improbable circumstances, and it is a real one, fully documented, fully confirmed by scientific observation. Sometimes the world does produce answers that are better than the mystery was dark. Not often, but sometimes. Number 21. The lights that follow you across the desert and have done so for over a century. The outback of Australia's central and northern regions produces a phenomenon that has no confirmed scientific explanation and that has been reported by a staggering range of witnesses for over 100 years. Luminous orbs ranging in size from a tennis ball to several meters across that appear at night, often above or near roads and dry riverbeds, that move with apparent deliberateness, that react to the presence of witnesses, that have been chased, followed, filmed, photographed, and observed by everyone from Aboriginal elders to NASA researchers, and that have never been captured or contained or definitively explained. They are called the Min Min lights in the Channel Country of southwest Queensland, which is where the most concentrated body of reports originates. But similar phenomena have been documented across the entire Central Australian region, in South Australia and the Northern Territory and Western Australia, across the Nullarbor Plain and through the McDonnell Ranges and along the Dry Creek beds of the Simpson Desert margins. The reports are extraordinary in their consistency. Witnesses describe a light that appears at a distance, sometimes following a vehicle, matching its speed exactly, maintaining a consistent distance for minutes or hours before suddenly vanishing. Witnesses describe lights that stop when a vehicle stops. Witnesses describe lights that retreat when approached and advance when retreated from. Several documented accounts describe lights that have followed single witnesses on foot, matching walking pace for extended periods. An Aboriginal elder named Gladys Tibingumpa from the Kuku-Yalanji people of far north Queensland described the Min Min lights as having always been part of the landscape, as entities that the land produces, that do not intend harm but that should not be followed or engaged with. This instruction, do not approach, matches the observed behavior of the lights themselves, which tend to retreat when pursuit is attempted. It is the kind of practical folk knowledge that accumulates over thousands of years of coexistence with a phenomenon, and that contains within it a protocol consistent with the phenomenon's actual behavior. A Queensland neuroscientist named Jack Pettigrew proposed in 2003 that the Min Min lights are a form of superior mirage, a Fata Morgana effect in which light sources below the horizon, potentially hundreds of kilometers distant, are refracted through temperature inversion layers in the atmosphere and appear as luminous objects at eye level. He argued that the peculiar atmospheric conditions of the Australian interior, with its extreme temperature differentials between the warm ground and the cool night air, create the conditions for this effect with unusual regularity. The Fata Morgana hypothesis is interesting and not dismissible. Temperature inversions over flat terrain can produce genuine optical effects, but the hypothesis struggles with the tracking behavior. A Fata Morgana image is a refraction of a distant light source. It would not match speed with a moving vehicle. It would not stop when a vehicle stops. It would not approach or retreat in response to the actions of a witness. These behaviors, documented across many independent accounts, require an explanation that the mirage hypothesis does not currently provide. The most informative modern data point is the infrared emission signature. Multiple investigators who have captured the lights on infrared sensitive equipment have noted that the lights emit more strongly in the near infrared portion of the spectrum than in visible light, which is unusual for a simple optical refraction and is consistent with a source that produces its own radiation, rather than simply refracting light from elsewhere. What kind of source that would be in the middle of an empty desert at 2 in the morning is not established. The lights are still out there. Every year, new accounts are added to the record. Truck drivers and station managers and traveling families and researchers with equipment all see them and add their descriptions to the long file. The file grows. The explanation does not yet exist in a form that accounts for all of the observations in the record. The desert keeps its energy and its light and its silence. The answer to the Min Min phenomenon is somewhere in the thermodynamics of the Australian night, or in the geology of the landscape that produces it, or in the electromagnetic properties of the rock and the atmosphere in the dark. Or it is in none of those places, and is something else entirely that has not yet been named. At this point in our journey tonight, I want to pause for a moment and ask you something. We are roughly halfway through. Which of these is sitting with you the most? Which one has you feeling that particular feeling? The one that is not quite unease and not quite wonder, but is somewhere between them in the dark? Drop it in the comments. Tell me the name. Tell me which mystery you're going to be thinking about when you finally close your eyes tonight or this morning or whenever sleep finds you. And tell me where you are. I love knowing where people are when they find these stories. Someone is always somewhere I did not expect. If you are not subscribed yet and you have made it this far into the night with me, this would be a good moment. Now, let us keep going. We are not done. Number 22. The opal that is said to carry a curse and the history that might actually explain it. Lightning Ridge is a town in the far northwest of New South Wales, about 700 kilometres from Sydney, in dry red dirt country close to the Queensland border. It is the only place in the world where black opal is found in significant quantities. Black opal is the rarest and most valuable form of opal, a gemstone that shows color in a dark base stone, producing displays of electric blue and green and red and orange that look, in a good specimen, like looking into a piece of the Milky Way through a keyhole. The most famous black opal in Australian history is called the Black Prince. And if you ask the people at Lightning Ridge about it, some of them will tell you about the people who owned it and the things that happened to them afterward. Not all of them will tell you this in a way that suggests they believe in curses as a metaphysical phenomenon. But the pattern is clear enough that even the pragmatic and the skeptical note it. Australian opal history is full of similar stories, associated with famous individual stones that passed through multiple owners and left a trail of bad fortune behind them. The explanation that is most historically interesting, and that most people do not know about, has to do with how many of these stones were originally obtained. Mining at Lightning Ridge in the early 20th century operated under conditions that were, by any contemporary assessment, deeply exploitative. Much of the land on which opal was discovered had deep significance to the Murawari and Yuwalare peoples who had lived in that country for thousands of years. In some cases, opal-bearing sites had ceremonial significance. The mining operations of the colonial and early post-colonial period did not engage with these existing relationships to the land and the stones in any meaningful way. The Murawari oral tradition includes specific teachings about certain stones that are not for human possession, that belong in the ground, and that removing them creates an imbalance that follows the person who carries them. This is not a superstition in the dismissive sense of that word. It is a sophisticated framework for understanding the relationship between people and the land that encodes thousands of years of observation. Whether you believe in the literal mechanism or not, the teaching conveys something real about the ethics of extraction. Several significant Australian opals have histories that are, at minimum, interesting in light of this framework. Owners who encountered financial ruin, owners who suffered illness, fires, losses. The Black Star of Queensland, a sapphire rather than an opal, but equally significant in the record of Australian gem stories, sat in a bank vault for many years after its original finders chose not to sell it, partly because of the stories attached to stones of that kind. The Lucky Country has always had a complex relationship with its luck. The minerals it is built on were extracted from a land that was taken from people who had a different understanding of what the minerals were and who they belonged to. Whether you frame that as a curse, or as history, or as ongoing consequence, the shadow of it is long, and the opals at Lightning Ridge are as beautiful as anything on Earth, in direct proportion to how much of that beauty is entirely impossible to fully account for. Number 23. The lost expedition that was never lost the way everyone said it was. In 1848, an explorer named Ludwig Leichhardt set out from the Darling Downs in Queensland with 7 companions on what was intended to be the first crossing of the Australian continent from east to west, from the settled southeast to the Swan River colony in Western Australia. The party was never seen again. No confirmed remains, no equipment, no journals, nothing conclusively attributable to the Leichhardt expedition was ever recovered. Leichhardt's name has become synonymous with vanishment in Australian history. He had already achieved the remarkable feat of the first overland journey from Brisbane to Port Essington on the Northern Territory coast in 1844 to 1845. He was a celebrated explorer. His second disappearance was a national shock and launched more than a dozen search expeditions over the following century and a half, none of which found anything definitive. The mystery of what happened to Leichhardt and his companions has produced a remarkable body of proposed explanations and claimed discoveries. In the 1870s, a pastoralist named Andrew Hume claimed to have found carved trees and camp relics in the interior of Queensland, consistent with a Leichhardt campsite. In 1900, remains and equipment were reported from a location in South Australia. In the 1930s, various artifacts, including what appeared to be a brass plate with an engraved L, were found in different parts of the interior. None of these discoveries survived rigorous examination as confirmed Leichhardt material. What is known from the records that do exist is that the expedition departed in good order and with adequate supplies for the initial stages of the journey. The route Leichhardt intended is not precisely known, which has complicated every search effort. He was methodical in his previous exploration and would have kept journals, which makes the complete absence of any written record all the more puzzling. Paper and leather and metal do not disappear in a century and a half without some trace. The most commonly proposed cause of death is violence, whether from an attack by Aboriginal groups whose country the expedition entered without permission or invitation, or from some internal conflict within the expedition itself. Leichhardt was known to have a difficult personality, and his relations with some previous expedition members had been strained. However, there is no documented evidence for either scenario. In 2006, a new analysis of the documentary record of the expedition's known route and supply situation led some researchers to propose that the party may have perished from thirst in the arid country west of the Darling River, that they became lost in terrain that appeared to offer water but did not, and that the bodies were buried by companions who then also succumbed. This would account for the complete absence of remains above ground. The continent is large. The country that Leichhardt entered is harsh and has changed significantly in a century and a half in terms of vegetation and human access. His bones and the bones of his 7 companions may be in the earth of any number of remote locations across a corridor several thousand kilometers long. He went west. That is all that can be said with confidence. The West kept him. Number 24. The town underneath the town where the living sleep among the dead. Coober Pedy is a mining town in the outback of South Australia, about 850 kilometres north of Adelaide. It sits in one of the most hostile environments in Australia for human habitation. Temperatures in summer regularly exceed 50 degrees Celsius on the surface. Water is scarce. The landscape is a maze of mullock heaps, the excavated earth from decades of opal mining that makes the surrounding terrain look, famously, like the surface of the moon, which is why parts of several science fiction films have been shot there. The response of Coober Pedy's residents to this environment is one of the most extraordinary adaptations in Australian settlement history. They went underground. More than half of Coober Pedy's population lives in homes carved directly into the rock of the hillsides. These are not temporary shelters. They are fully appointed residences with multiple rooms, modern plumbing, electricity, furniture, artworks, and in some cases elaborate architectural detail. They maintain a constant temperature of approximately 23 degrees Celsius year-round, regardless of what is happening above ground. They are quiet and cool, and in many cases genuinely beautiful in a distinctive way, with the exposed sandstone walls and arched ceilings giving them an aesthetic that no surface architecture can replicate. There are underground churches, an underground art gallery, underground hotels where tourists sleep in rock-cut rooms, an underground bar. The Serbian Orthodox Church of St. Elijah is carved into a hillside, and its interior features detailed paintings on the stone walls in a style that combines Orthodox iconographic tradition with the textures of the Australian outback. The mystery of Coober Pedy is not a crime mystery. It is the mystery of human resilience and adaptation taken to its most extreme and most surreal expression. A community decided that if the surface was uninhabitable, they would simply live beneath it, and they built an entire underground city that functions in most ways like any other Australian town, except that the roof is solid rock and the temperature is perfect and the silence at night is absolute. What Coober Pedy also contains, less comfortably, is one of the most criminally volatile histories of any Australian town. The opal trade, which operates in cash and involves stones of unpredictable and enormous value, has produced a consistent pattern of violence, claim-jumping, theft, and murder over the century of the town's existence. Opal worth millions of dollars has been stolen. People have been killed over single stones. Dynamite, which is available to any registered miner, has been used to settle disputes in ways that leave very little forensic evidence. The underground nature of the town complicates everything forensically. The maze of tunnels and abandoned shafts beneath and around the town is not fully mapped. Old workings collapse and reform. Material buried in abandoned shafts may remain hidden indefinitely. Whatever the opal fields of Coober Pedy have buried over the decades of their most violent history is probably still there, in the dark below the dark, alongside the opals that nobody has found yet. The town is alive and functional. Visitors come from around the world to stay in the underground hotels and see the underground churches. The inhabitants go about their lives in their cool, rock-cut rooms, while the desert sun blisters the surface 50 feet above their heads. It is one of the genuinely original places on Earth, produced by necessity and stubbornness, and the very Australian characteristic of refusing to be beaten by the landscape even when the landscape is actively trying to kill you. Number 25, the sea country and the people who knew it before anyone else did. This is the last mystery on our list tonight. and it is different from all the others. It is not a specific event or a specific disappearance or a specific encounter with something unexplained. It is a pattern of knowledge that should not exist according to the conventional timeline of human history, and that has been sitting quietly in Aboriginal Australian oral tradition for 65,000 years, waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. Modern science has now confirmed that Aboriginal Australians arrived on the continent approximately 65,000 years ago, making them the oldest continuously maintained culture on Earth. What science has also confirmed through sea level mapping of the period before the last ice age ended and the sea levels rose to their current position is that the Australian coastline in that era was dramatically different from what it is today. Much of what is now the continental shelf, the shallow underwater platform extending from the modern coast, was dry land. Large areas of the sea floor between Australia and Tasmania and between Australia and New Guinea were above water. The continent was significantly larger, and Aboriginal Australians remember it. This is not metaphor, this is documented linguistic and oral historical fact. In 2015, an Australian researcher named Patrick Nunn and a linguist named Nicholas Reid published a study examining Aboriginal oral traditions from communities along the Australian coastline. They documented stories from multiple unconnected communities across the continent that described the coastline being at a different position, land where there is now sea, specific bays and inlets that no longer exist in the locations described. They matched these descriptions against sea level data and confirmed that the stories described accurately the state of the Australian coastline between approximately 10,000 and 7,000 years ago, during the period when global sea levels rose following the end of the last ice age. This means that oral history traditions from Australian Aboriginal communities have preserved accurate geographical information for at least 7,000 years and potentially up to 10,000 years. Information transmitted faithfully through oral tradition across hundreds of generations. Information about the shape of a coastline that no living person has seen, that exists only in the geological record and in the stories. The Yuin people of the New South Wales South Coast tell stories of a bay that is now beneath the sea at a location consistent with the pre-rise coastline. The Narunga people of the Yorke Peninsula in South Australia tell stories of a landscape where Spencer Gulf is now open water. The stories are specific enough and the matches to the geological data accurate enough that Nunn and Reid concluded they could only have been preserved through direct transmission from people who had physically seen what was described. This is one of the most significant findings in Australian anthropology of the last 30 years. It is not widely known outside academic circles, and it deserves to be much more widely known. What the dreaming tracks across the continent mean, in terms of their relationship to the actual landscape, is a question that Australian scientists and Aboriginal knowledge holders have been discussing with increasing seriousness. The songlines that map the country, that encode in their verses the features of landscape and the sources of water and the routes between places, may contain within them information that is tens of thousands of years old and that has been proven, in at least some cases, to be accurate. The oldest continuously maintained cultural tradition on Earth has been holding information about this planet's history that the rest of human civilization only began to document with written records in the last few thousand years. The memory of Australia is older than the writing that records it and older than the civilizations that invented writing. It is in the land and in the stories and in the languages and in the voices of people who have been here since a time when the continental shelf was coastline and the sea had not yet risen to fill the valleys where people walked and fished and knew the world in a way that the world has forgotten everywhere else. That is the mystery that is not a mystery. It is the answer that was always there, if anyone had been willing to listen for it in the right direction. Number 26. The giant figure in the desert that nobody admits to drawing. In June of 1998, a pilot flying over the remote outback of South Australia, south of the town of Marrie, observed something in the landscape below that should not have been there. Scratched into the stony desert surface, covering an area 4 kilometers long and stretched across a plateau, was an enormous figure, a human figure, human. A man, drawn in the style of Aboriginal figurative art, holding what appeared to be a spear or throwing stick, and positioned in a posture that suggested movement, or perhaps ceremony. The figure is called the Marrie Man, or in some discussions, Stuart's giant, though the Stuart attribution came later and is not universally accepted. It is one of the largest geoglyphs ever documented on Earth, comparable in scale to the famous Nazca lines of Peru. The figure itself is created by removing the surface layer of desert stone to expose the lighter rock below, in a technique consistent with other geoglyphs worldwide. The lines are about 35 centimeters wide, and the figure, when seen from altitude, is faultlessly precise. The proportions are correct, the posture is coherent, it is, by any assessment, a work of considerable skill and planning, and nobody knows who made it. That is not hyperbole. No one has claimed responsibility. No local Aboriginal group has identified it as their work, which is significant because the depiction of a male hunter figure in that style would typically be associated with a specific cultural tradition and would be acknowledged as such by the relevant custodians. No government agency commissioned it. No artist has come forward. No construction crew has been identified. No tire tracks or vehicle evidence consistent with the construction process was identified on the plateau surface around the figure when investigators examined it shortly after the discovery. South Australian authorities investigated. The Australian Federal Police investigated. Journalists investigated. Researchers from universities investigated. The consensus among those investigations is that the figure was made by a person or persons with significant technical resources, including precise survey-level planning and some mechanical means of displacing the desert surface in consistent lines across a 4-kilometer span, and who then disappeared without leaving any trace of their presence or their identity. A series of clues were found near the figure in the months after its discovery, apparently left by the creator or creators deliberately. These included a small plaque, a glass jar, and eventually a flag that appeared near the figure over several months. These artifacts contained references and suggestions of possible motives, including suggestions of American involvement, references to specific dates and events, and what appeared to be deliberate obfuscation rather than genuine revelation. A theory that an American individual or group was responsible has been floated but never confirmed. The Maori man's precise creation date is also uncertain. Satellite images from the period suggest it was created between early 1998 and the time of its aerial discovery. That means someone created a 4-kilometer wide geoglyph in a remote South Australian desert, with whatever equipment and planning that required, without anyone in the surrounding region observing the process. The desert surface in that region of South Australia is extremely sensitive. Disturbance to the gibber surface, the distinctive stony surface of that type of terrain, is visible for decades. The disturbance required to create a figure that size, with that kind of precision, would have required sustained mechanical activity, and yet the figure simply appeared. Or more precisely, the figure was always there, and a pilot simply saw it for the first time in June of 1998. 26 years later, no one has admitted to making it. Number 27. The Dingo and the Mother and the 32 Years. It took to get the truth right. On the 17th of August, 1980, a 9-week-old baby named Azaria Chamberlain disappeared from a campsite near Uluru in the Northern Territory. Her parents, Michael and Lindy Chamberlain, were camping there with their family. Lindy Chamberlain said she saw a dingo emerge from the family tent with something in its mouth. She went to the tent and found her baby gone. What followed is one of the most grotesque miscarriages of justice in Australian legal history, and it also contains within it one of the most documented and most examined wildlife behavior events ever recorded in this country. The initial inquest in 1981 found that Azaria Chamberlain had been taken and killed by a dingo, consistent with Lindy Chamberlain's account. This finding was overturned. A second inquest in 1982 produced a finding that there was insufficient evidence to exclude Lindy Chamberlain as responsible for the death. She was subsequently charged with murder. Her husband Michael was charged as an accessory. In 1982, Lindy Chamberlain was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. She was in prison when she gave birth to another child. The evidence against Lindy Chamberlain included, most prominently, forensic analysis that claimed to have found fetal blood in the family's car. This blood was later shown to have been a substance used to coat the interior of cars in the manufacturing process. A sound deadening compound, which the forensic technique used had incorrectly identified as blood. The evidence against her was fundamentally flawed, and the flaws were not identified until years after the conviction. In 1986, Azaria's jacket was found near a dingo lair at Uluru. This was the evidence that finally prompted the release of Lindy Chamberlain from prison and the quashing of the conviction. But the full legal resolution did not come until 1988, when a royal commission into the case found that Lindy Chamberlain was wrongly convicted, and even that was not the end. The coroner's finding that Azaria had been taken by a dingo was not officially confirmed until a fourth inquest in 2012. 32 years after the death of a 9-week-old baby, a coronial court finally confirmed what her mother had said from the beginning. A dingo took her daughter. The court specifically cited growing evidence of the capacity of dingoes to prey on small children, including attacks that had occurred in the intervening decades, as part of the basis for the finding. Lindy Chamberlain lost years of her life to a wrongful conviction based on faulty science, and many have argued on the general public's unwillingness to believe that a dingo could carry away a human infant. The Australian media of the early 1980s was relentlessly hostile to Lindy Chamberlain. Jokes were made. Her religious beliefs, she and Michael were Seventh-day Adventists, were used against her in public perception, if not in court. She was convicted in the court of public opinion before and after the legal conviction, and exonerated in both only with extraordinary difficulty. The wildlife behavior dimension of this case is also significant. It is now well documented that dingoes are capable of targeting infants and small children. Multiple attacks on children at Uluru and at Fraser Island have been recorded in the decades since 1980. The picture of dingo behavior that has emerged from systematic study is consistent with Lindy Chamberlain's account in ways that the scientists of 1982 did not fully understand, and that the general public of 1982 was not prepared to accept. Azaria Chamberlain has never been found. Her remains were not recovered. She is memorialized at Uluru. Lindy Chamberlain, who later remarried and took the name Lindy Chamberlain Crichton, has spoken about her experience extensively and with a directness and lack of bitterness that most people who have followed this case find genuinely remarkable. She was convicted, she was wrong, she was exonerated, she is still here, and Uluru stands where it has always stood, red and ancient and indifferent to the human dramas that play out at its base. Number 28, The Failed Crossing. That explains almost everything about the Australian interior. In 1860 and 1861, two explorers named Robert O'Hara Burke and William John Wills led an expedition from Melbourne that successfully crossed the Australian continent from south to north, reaching the Gulf of Carpentaria, the first confirmed overland crossing of the continent by Europeans. They then turned around and began the return journey, and almost everyone in the party died. The full story of the Burke and Wills expedition is one of the most devastating case studies in the history of human misjudgment, and it reveals something fundamental about the relationship between European colonial ambition and the Australian landscape that resonates across the entire history of the continent. Burke was a police superintendent with no formal exploration experience. He was charismatic and impulsive. He was appointed leader of the largest and most lavishly funded exploration expedition in Australian history, not because he was the most qualified person, but because he was the most energetic advocate for his own appointment. He had no particular knowledge of navigation, no understanding of desert survival, and a profound impatience with caution. The expedition set out from Royal Park in Melbourne in August 1860 with 19 men, 27 camels, horses, and wagons, carrying over 20 tons of supplies. It was, at the time, the most elaborately equipped exploration party ever dispatched in Australia. It should have been able to sustain its members comfortably for years. Burke's decisions on the journey north progressively stripped the expedition of everything that could have saved it. He split the party multiple times, abandoning supplies and men at depot camps along the road. He pushed forward at speeds that exhausted the animals and the men. When he reached the Gulf and turned around, he had a small and depleted party, inadequate supplies for the return journey, and no margin for error of any kind. The return journey became a race against depletion that they were always going to lose. At a depot camp called Cooper's Creek in what is now far southwest Queensland, they arrived on the evening of April 21st, 1861, to find a note carved into a tree and the embers of a fire still warm. The depot party that had been waiting for them had left that very morning, after waiting 4 months beyond their instructions, and had ridden north toward Menindee. That timing, the arrival hours after the departure of the people who could have saved them, is the most gut-wrenching coincidence in Australian exploration history. If Burke had pushed the pace one more day, if the depot party had waited one more day, the gap was hours. Burke and Wills and a third man named John King were alone at Cooper's Creek in the desert with food for only a few weeks. Burke made more bad decisions. He chose to head south and west toward a station he believed was accessible rather than following the creek east, where water and eventually help would have been available. He was wrong about the distances and the terrain. They became trapped in the desert. The expedition was saved from complete oblivion only because John King was eventually found alive, barely, by an Aboriginal group who had been providing the stranded explorers with fish and nardoo, a type of fern spore. They had in fact been eating nardoo in significant quantities. What neither the explorers nor the Aboriginal people who provided it fully understood was that nardoo, unless properly processed using techniques that the Yandrawanda people knew and the explorers did not, binds thiamine in the body and prevents its absorption. Burke and Wills died from thiamine deficiency while apparently eating adequate quantities of food. They were killed by a nutritional deficiency in a plant they were eating wrong, surrounded by people who knew how to eat it correctly, and were too proud or too culturally incapacitated to learn. That is the specific mechanism. The broader cause is the same cause that runs through so many Australian disasters of the colonial era. The refusal to learn from people who already knew. The insistence on self-sufficiency in an environment that demands collaboration. The equation of civilization with knowledge and wilderness with ignorance, when the opposite was, in many ways, true. Burke and Wills have statues in Melbourne. Their expedition is in every Australian history curriculum. The Yandrawanda people whose knowledge could have saved them are mentioned, if at all, briefly. That distribution of remembrance is itself part of the mystery this country has been working through for 230 years and has not finished working through yet. Number 29. The drowning place that has claimed 20 lives at the same spot. The Devil's Pool, near Babinda in far north Queensland, is a site in a rainforest gorge in the Bellenden Kerr Range where Babinda Creek narrows and passes through a series of large boulders and rock formations before dropping into a pool. It is beautiful in the way that much of tropical far north Queensland is beautiful, which is to say that it is the kind of beauty that stops your breath, all dark green canopy and pale grey rock and water the colour of greenstone. It has also been the site of the deaths of at least 17 young men, and possibly as many as 20 since records began being kept. Almost all of them men, almost all of them young. Almost all of them died in a specific stretch of the creek near the main pool, despite warning signs and barriers and local knowledge about the site's dangers. The Yidinji people, the traditional owners of the country around Babinda, have a story about the Devil's Pool that explains its danger in terms of a spiritual rather than purely physical cause. In the story, a young woman of the Yidinji named Ulana was promised in marriage to an elder of her clan. Before the marriage, she fell in love with a young man named Barangam from a visiting clan. When the relationship was discovered, Barangam was driven away, and Ulana pursued him to the gorge. She threw herself into the water to escape being separated from him. Her spirit remains in the water. She is calling for her lost love, and she calls to young men. Whether you engage with the spiritual dimension of this story or not, the pattern of deaths at this site is genuinely anomalous in a way that purely physical explanations do not fully account for. The physical dangers are real and documented. Submerged rocks, strong currents, a suction effect created by the narrow channel, a tendency for the water level to vary unpredictably. These are genuine and deadly hazards. The warnings at the site are extensive and have been repeatedly upgraded. But the consistent demographic pattern of the deaths, young males, many of whom were not swimming but simply slipped from rocks while looking at the pool or taking photographs, the consistency of the location within the broader gorge where the deaths occur, and the total number of fatalities at a site with clearly marked dangers that reasonable people should be able to avoid, have led local people and researchers to conclude that something is happening at Devil's Pool that purely hydraulic and geological explanations do not capture. The Queensland government has invested significantly in barrier and signage improvements at the site. The death rate has not been reduced to zero. The Yidinji elders maintain that the warnings that matter are not the ones on the signs. Number 30, the Bass Strait Triangle and the machines that disappear. Frederick Volentich is the most famous person to disappear in the airspace and waters of Bass Strait, but he's very far from the only one. Bass Strait, the body of water between the Australian mainland and Tasmania, has a record of aviation and maritime disappearances that is statistically unusual and that has attracted the same kind of attention and the same kind of explanatory frameworks as the Bermuda Triangle in the North Atlantic. The comparison is instructive but inexact. The Bermuda Triangle mythology was substantially constructed from the creative arrangement of incidents that were geographically spread and temporally diverse, and the case for genuine anomaly in that area has been convincingly challenged by statistical analysis. Bass Strait's record is more concentrated and more consistent in its specific character. Bass Strait is genuinely one of the most treacherous stretches of water in the world. It is shallow, which means that weather systems can build rapidly and unexpectedly severe swells. It is exposed to the full force of the Southern Ocean's westerly weather systems, which can generate storm conditions with extraordinary speed. The shipping and aviation history of the strait goes back to the earliest days of Australian settlement, and the losses that history records are staggering. In the 19th century alone, hundreds of ships were lost in Bass Strait. What gives the modern disappearances in the strait a quality that goes beyond ordinary maritime and aviation misfortune is the pattern of loss without debris. Valentic is the most cited example, but he's not unique. Several light aircraft that disappeared over the strait in the 1970s and 1980s produced no debris fields. Several vessels that sank in the strait in circumstances that should have produced substantial surface evidence produced very little or nothing recoverable. One possible explanation that is specific to Bass Strait's geography is the depth variation. In some areas, the strait floor drops into geological features that are essentially trenches, deep enough and specific enough in their configuration to contain sinking objects in a way that prevents debris from reaching the surface normally. Combined with the strong current patterns that run through the strait, it is possible that material lost in certain locations simply does not surface in places where search operations would find it. Whether that explains the pattern of clean vanishments or whether it is simply a coincidental feature of the region's geography is not established. The Bass Strait Triangle is not as extensively documented a phenomenon as its Atlantic counterpart, partly because Australian maritime and aviation culture has tended to frame individual incidents as individual tragedies rather than as part of a pattern. But the pattern is there. For anyone who looks at the full record in geographic terms, Valentich, the Waratah, the King Island air disaster, the Sydney to Hobart yacht race storms, the strait has claimed an enormous amount of human endeavour and left very little of it behind. It is a beautiful crossing on a clear day. It is something else entirely in the wrong weather. Number 31. The soldier who walked out of the jungle. 30 years after the war ended. In 1947, 2 years after the end of the Second World War, an Australian soldier named Leonard Siflete was executed on a beach in New Guinea. His execution was photographed. The photograph became one of the most widely reproduced and most disturbing images of the Pacific War. It shows Siflete kneeling on the sand with his hands bound and a Japanese officer raising a sword above him. What is in the frame is the moment before the sword falls. But this story is not about Siflete. This story is about the Australian soldiers who did not come home in 1945, who were listed as missing, whose fates were unknown for years or decades, and who in some cases were never definitively resolved. The Pacific theatre of the Second World War produced an enormous category of Australian dead and missing who were not accounted for in the immediate aftermath of the conflict. The jungles of New Guinea, Borneo, and the various island theatres absorbed many of them in ways that left no recoverable remains. The Australian War Memorial's records of missing personnel from the Pacific Campaign include thousands of men whose exact fates were never confirmed. What makes this mystery category particular is the handful of cases, confirmed and alleged, of Allied soldiers who continued to live in various Pacific locations for years after the war ended, either because they did not know it had ended or because they had adopted new lives in remote communities. The most famous case globally is the Japanese soldier Hiru Onoda, who continued fighting in the Philippine jungle until 1974. But there are documented Australian and Allied cases that are less well known. Several reports emerged from remote parts of New Guinea and the Indonesian archipelago in the late 1940s and into the 1950s of fair-skinned men living in remote communities who were believed to be former Allied personnel. Some of these reports were followed up by Australian officials. Some produced identifications, some produced only frustrating near misses, communities visited where the man in question had recently left or was not present. The fate of a small number of Australian servicemen listed as missing in action from the Pacific Theatre remains officially unresolved. They are not confirmed dead, they are not confirmed alive anywhere. Their names remain on missing lists. Whether any of them survived the war and chose not to return, or were unable to return, or simply disappeared into the jungle in ways that left no trace, is not known. The war left its missing scattered across the Pacific in ways that will never be fully recovered or fully reconciled. The Australian War Graves Commission continues its work of identification and recovery of remains from the Pacific Theatre. New discoveries are still made. In 2019, remains identified as those of an Australian serviceman were found in Papua New Guinea and repatriated. 74 years after the war ended, the jungle gives them up slowly, if it gives them up at all. Number 32. The plague ship and the quarantine station that trapped the living with the dead. For most of the 19th and early 20th centuries, ships arriving in Sydney Harbour from overseas ports were required to stop at the quarantine station at North Head, on the northern headland at the entrance to the harbour, if there was any evidence of disease aboard. North Head is a dramatic and beautiful headland of sandstone cliffs and heathland overlooking the Tasman Sea. The view from the quarantine station buildings is extraordinary. What happened inside those buildings was not. Over the more than a century that the North Head quarantine station operated, beginning in 1832 and continuing in various forms until 1984, it processed ships carrying passengers who were sick with cholera, typhoid, smallpox, influenza, bubonic plague, and scarlet fever. Many of the passengers who entered the station did not leave it alive. The cemetery on the headland contains over 570 confirmed graves, and historical records suggest the actual number of people who died and were buried there is higher. The scale and nature of what occurred at North Head, thousands of people quarantined in conditions that were, in the early decades, primitive and demoralizing. Surrounded by disease, cut off from their families, watching their fellow passengers die makes it one of the most psychically charged sites in the country. Whether you believe in the literal persistence of the dead or not, the density of human suffering that passed through that place over 150 years is not nothing. The station is now a heritage and tourist site. Tours are conducted by day and by night. The ghost tours, which have been running for decades, have produced a consistent and extensive record of reported anomalous experiences from visitors and tour guides. The experiences reported are not of the simple atmospheric kind: shadows in corridors, sounds at night, the usual repertoire of old building unease. Some of them are specific and consistent in a way that is difficult to attribute solely to suggestion or imagination. A particular building, the third-class accommodation block, produces a consistent pattern of reports. The sounds reported there, described variously as children crying and as voices in languages that guides and visitors cannot identify, have been reported independently by dozens of people over many years. A room within the building where a family of children died during the 1918 Spanish influenza pandemic is the specific location of many of these reports. The Spanish influenza pandemic of 1918 killed approximately 15,000 Australians and infected hundreds of thousands more. The North Head station was heavily used during this period to process ships carrying infected passengers. The 1918 period is the most heavily documented in the station's history in terms of the volume and severity of cases managed there. What people experience in that building, if it is experienced consistently by independent witnesses with no prior knowledge of its history, is either a remarkable coincidence of atmospheric and suggestive effects concentrated in one specific location in one specific way, or it is something that does not fit comfortably into the categories we use to describe what physical places are capable of. The harbour is visible from the headland. Sydney spreads south and west behind it in all its contemporary noise and light and life. And North Head sits at the entrance, as it always has, containing what it contains. The view is beautiful. The history is not simple. Both of those things are true simultaneously, which is generally the condition of any place in Australia that is old enough to have one. Number 33. The lake that has risen and fallen and tells a story nobody wanted to hear. Lake George, near Canberra in the Australian Capital Territory, is a large, shallow lake that has an extraordinarily variable water level history. In wet periods, it fills to a substantial body of water, covering an area of approximately 40 kilometers by 25 kilometers. In dry periods, it empties, sometimes completely, sometimes to the point where its bed is used for grazing and farming, and even at various times motor racing. The lake fills and empties on cycles that are not fully correlated with local rainfall patterns, which is unusual. What is less well known about Lake George is that its variability is not simply a modern or historical phenomenon. The lake's sediment record, examined by geologists and paleoclimatologists, contains a record of its filling and emptying cycles going back tens of thousands of years. And that sediment record contains, alongside the climate data, something else. Charcoal, specifically charcoal that dates to a period between approximately 120,000 and 140,000 years ago, during a warm period between ice ages. The charcoal layers are extensive and suggest large-scale burning events. The timing of these burning events predates the current established understanding of when humans arrived in Australia by approximately 50,000 to 60,000 years. This finding, first published in a peer-reviewed journal in the 1990s, has been controversial since it appeared. The mainstream view of Australian archaeological science holds that humans arrived approximately 65,000 years ago, based on the most robustly dated archaeological sites currently confirmed. If humans were present and burning the landscape at Lake George 120,000 years ago, that timeline would need to be substantially revised. The counter-argument is that the charcoal could have been produced by lightning strikes or other natural fire sources rather than by human burning. Australia does have a long history of lightning-ignited natural fires, and the existence of charcoal in sediment layers does not by itself prove human presence. The scientific argument about this evidence has not been resolved. It sits in the literature, cited and contested, and not dismissed but not accepted as proven. A handful of other sites in Australia have produced evidence that some researchers interpret as suggesting human presence earlier than the currently accepted date, and the debate about Australia's prehistory and the timing of human arrival continues to evolve. Lake George fills and empties. The sediment at its bottom accumulates its record of climate and fire and time. And somewhere in the record of those 140,000 years, there may be evidence of people who arrived at a time that the textbooks have not yet caught up to. People who looked at the same landscape and the same sky and lit fires that left traces in the mud for researchers to find 100,000 years later and argue about. Number 34. The largest living organism on the planet and the mystery of how it survived. Under approximately 12,000 square kilometers of shallow seawater in the Shark Bay World Heritage Area in Western Australia, there is a single organism, not a colony of organisms, not an ecosystem of related organisms, one organism. It is a meadow of seagrass called Posidonia australis, and recent genetic analysis has determined that the entire meadow, all 12,000 square kilometers of it, is a single genetic individual, a single plant that has spread vegetatively across an area roughly the size of Croatia. The genetic analysis that confirmed this was published in 2022. It found that the seagrass meadow, which has likely been growing in Shark Bay for at least 4,500 years, and possibly significantly longer, had expanded through a process of rhizome extension, the spreading of underground root-like structures, rather than through seed dispersal. Every part of the meadow is genetically identical to every other part. It is one plant. This is genuinely one of the most astonishing discoveries in the history of Australian biology. It makes the seagrass meadow at Shark Bay the largest known organism on Earth by area, surpassing the previous record holder, a honey fungus network in Oregon, USA. The mystery embedded in this discovery is the question of how it survived. Posidonia seagrass meadows are extraordinarily sensitive to environmental disturbance. They are killed by excess nutrients, by sediment disruption, by disease, by elevated temperature, by reduced salinity. The Shark Bay meadow exists in an environment that would kill most seagrass, because the bay's unusual circulation produces water that is sometimes twice the normal salinity of the ocean, and significantly warmer than the surrounding sea. The Posidonia at Shark Bay has adapted to these conditions over its long existence, but those same conditions make it highly unlikely that any disturbed section of the meadow could ever be restored once damaged. It has survived, as far as the genetic record shows, for thousands of years in conditions that should have killed it, because it adapted rather than retreating. It colonized rather than contracted. It is, in the most fundamental biological sense, one of the great survivors on this planet, not through resilience in the way that we usually mean that word, not through toughness or hardness, but through the slow, patient, vegetative expansion of something that grows gently into available space and continues regardless. That is a kind of mystery that does not involve missing persons or unexplained lights or historical injustices. It is a mystery of a different order. How does something so fragile become something so vast? How does a plant that can be killed by a change in salinity spread across 12,000 square kilometers of hostile water over thousands of years without once breaking the single thread of its genetic continuity? The answer is time. The answer is always time in Australia. Time, and the particular quality of persistence that the landscape produces in everything that manages to survive within it. Number 35. The massacre records that were sealed and the country that does not know its own history. Australia has a violent colonial history. This is a statement of historical fact, documented in government records, court documents, newspaper accounts, pastoral diaries, missionary records, and in the oral traditions of Aboriginal communities across the continent. Between 1788 and the early decades of the 20th century, frontier violence between settlers and Aboriginal Australians resulted in the deaths of a very large number of Aboriginal people, in events ranging from individual killings to organized massacres involving significant numbers of victims. The mystery, and it is a real one, is that the full extent of this violence is not known. Not because records do not exist, but because many of those that do exist have been imperfectly preserved, deliberately suppressed, or simply never fully examined and collated. Australia does not have a settled national account of what happened on its colonial frontier, in the way that some other nations have produced truth and reconciliation processes that, however imperfectly, attempted to map the extent of historical violence. A project called the Colonial Frontier Massacres Project, conducted by Newcastle University and led by historian Professor Lyndall Ryan, has been mapping documented massacre sites across Australia since 2017. The project has identified over 500 massacre sites to date, defining a massacre as the killing of 6 or more people. The number is widely understood to be a significant undercount, because the documentary record is incomplete, and because many events occurred in locations with no independent witnesses capable of producing the accounts that would enter the historical record. The total number of Aboriginal Australians killed in frontier violence during the colonial period is estimated by historians in the range of tens of thousands, with some estimates significantly higher. The estimate is an estimate because the records are incomplete, because many deaths were not recorded at all, because records that were made were sometimes lost or destroyed, and because the historical focus of Australian colonial record keeping did not prioritise the counting of Aboriginal dead. This is the mystery that is not presented as a mystery in the way that strange lights or missing persons are presented as mysteries, because it is not a mystery of the unknown, but of the deliberately or negligently unrecorded. The truth is knowable approximately through the systematic work that researchers like those at the Frontier Massacres Project are doing. The full truth, the names and the numbers, and the specific locations and the specific events is not fully recoverable because too much of it was never written down, or was written down in accounts that are now inaccessible. Countries carry their histories in the architecture of their public memory. What a country chooses to build monuments to and what it chooses to leave unmarked tells you something important about what that country understands itself to be. Australia has been working with increasing seriousness and increasing difficulty on understanding what it needs to account for. That process is still active. The records that have been sealed, the accounts that have been lost, the sites that are unmarked are part of what it is still working through. The mystery is not unknowable, it is incompletely known. And the difference between those two things is the difference between a question that cannot be answered and a question that has not yet been answered, which is a distinction that matters very much to the communities whose history it is. Number 36. The thing that ate the great white shark and left the tag behind. In 2003, researchers attached a tracking tag to a healthy great white shark in the waters off Australia's south coast. Great white sharks in that region are large, powerful apex predators. The individual tagged was approximately 3 meters long and in excellent condition. The tag was designed to track its movements over an extended period, recording depth, temperature, and location. Several months after the tag was attached, it washed ashore. When researchers analyzed the data recorded on the tag, they found something extraordinary. The tag had, at a certain point, descended to a depth of approximately 570 meters over an extremely short period. The temperature sensor showed a rapid increase to 26 degrees Celsius, consistent with the interior temperature of an animal's stomach. The tag then remained at depth for some time before ascending and eventually drifting to shore. The interpretation of this data is that the tagged great white shark was eaten. Something ate it. Something large enough to consume a 3-meter great white shark, powerful enough to dive rapidly to 570 meters, and warm enough internally to warm the tag to 26 degrees Celsius. Whatever ate the shark digested it and continued on its way, eventually releasing the tag when it was either expelled or the shark's remains decomposed enough for the tag to drift free. The question of what ate the shark became a significant topic of discussion in marine biology circles, and when the story gained wider media attention in 2014 in popular media, the leading theory among researchers is a very large great white shark, significantly larger than the tagged individual, of a size consistent with what the tag's depth record implied in terms of the swimming capacity and hunting depth of an extremely large specimen. Great white sharks of extraordinary size have been documented in Australian waters. A shark known as Deep Blue, though she was encountered in Mexican waters, and several individuals documented off South Australia and in the Great Australian Bight, have been confirmed at lengths of over 6 meters. A shark of that size and mass would be capable of consuming a 3-meter individual and diving to the depths recorded. The mystery, then, is less about what species ate the shark and more about the specific individual that did so. If there is a great white shark in Australian waters large enough to eat another great white of 3 meters, as a relatively routine feeding event, how large is it? What is its range? How old is it? Great white sharks can live for up to 70 years or more. A very large, very old individual could have been hunting in Australian waters since the mid-20th century, without ever being properly documented. The ocean off Australia's south coast is cold and deep, and does not give up its apex predators for inspection. Whatever ate that shark is still down there, growing older, crossing the continental shelf in the dark water below the tourist dive boats, leaving only the occasional anomalous tag reading to suggest the scale of what moves beneath the surface of things. Number 37. The message carved into a tree that might change the history of everything. In the Daintree rainforest of far north Queensland, carved into the face of a rock at a site known to local Aboriginal communities, and to a small number of researchers, but not widely publicized, there are markings. Markings that some researchers have identified as belonging to a writing system from the ancient Near East, not graffiti, not a recent hoax. Markings weathered and aged in a way consistent with considerable antiquity, in a style that some epigraphers, specialists in ancient inscriptions, have compared to ancient Phoenician or Egyptian scripts. The Daintree carvings are one of several similar sites across Australia that have attracted serious, if controversial, attention from researchers interested in the question of pre-Columbian contact with the continent. The Gosford glyphs, a set of markings in a cave system near Gosford in New South Wales, are the most widely discussed of these sites. The Gosford glyphs have attracted significant mainstream archaeological dismissal as a 19th or 20th century hoax, but have also attracted genuine scholarly interest from a small number of Egyptologists who have argued that the inscriptions are consistent with specific forms of ancient Egyptian script and contain readable content. The mainstream archaeological position on pre-European contact with Australia is clear. There is no credible, confirmed evidence of contact between Australia and any civilization outside the region before the documented Portuguese and Dutch contacts of the 16th and 17th centuries. The evidence for pre-European contact that has been offered, including the cave markings, the mahogany ship, various objects found in archaeological contexts, has either been shown to be misidentified or has not been confirmed to the standard required for academic acceptance. That is a precise and defensible position. It is also, necessarily, a position that leaves open the possibility that evidence has not yet been found or has been misattributed. The Australian interior has not been comprehensively surveyed for archaeological sites. The rainforest of far north Queensland has areas that have been visited by very few researchers. The continental shelf that was dry land during lower sea level periods has not been archaeologically surveyed to any meaningful degree. The mystery here is not whether these specific carved markings are definitively what some researchers claim them to be. The mystery is what Australia's very long prehistory actually contains, at a level of detail and completeness that current archaeological evidence cannot yet provide. The answer to what happened on this continent over 65,000 years, and who, if anyone, visited it, and what evidence of those visits might be sitting in the landscape waiting to be found, is incomplete. It will become less incomplete over time. It always does. The archaeological record of any country is a work in progress, and Australia's is a longer and larger work in progress than most. What is found in the next 50 years of serious and systematic investigation will probably change some of what we currently think we know. That is the nature of historical knowledge. It is provisional, it is subject to revision, and it is always more interesting than the version that was certain. Number 38, the town that floated away on a flood and the people who went with it. On the 5th of February, 1851, a flood event now called the Separation Floods swept through the settlements of New South Wales and Victoria. The floods of that summer were the most catastrophic since European settlement of the continent began. Rivers across a huge area of southeastern Australia rose to levels that had not been recorded and have rarely been matched since. Towns and homesteads that had been established on river flats, chosen specifically for the fertility of the soil deposited there, discovered why those soils were so fertile. In the settlements along the Goulburn and Ovens rivers in Victoria, entire communities were swept away. Homesteads built by settlers who had arrived from England and Ireland and Scotland in the preceding decades, who had established farms and raised families in a landscape they were still learning to read, found themselves facing a phenomenon that the landscape produced regularly, but that the settlers had no cultural memory of and no way to anticipate. The mystery embedded in this historical catastrophe is the question of the missing. The record of deaths from the 1851 floods is fragmentary. Contemporary record keeping in remote settlements was inconsistent, and the chaos of the flood event itself meant that in many cases, the communities that would have recorded a death were themselves destroyed or dispersed. The full death toll of the separation floods has never been established. Some researchers who have studied the event believe that the actual number of deaths was significantly higher than the official records suggest. In isolated communities where every adult would have been known to every other adult, the departure or absence of a family could be noticed and recorded. But in a period of general population movement, driven partly by the gold rush that was occurring simultaneously in parts of Victoria in 1851, the disappearance of a family from a settlement might have been attributed to voluntary departure rather than flood death. The gold rush complicates the record enormously. In 1851, thousands of people were arriving in Victoria from interstate and overseas and moving through the region in search of goldfields. The identity and fate of transient individuals in that population is essentially unrecoverable. If families or individuals who were newly arrived and unknown to the local permanent population died in the flood event, their deaths may not have been recorded anywhere. The floodplain of southeastern Australia is now significantly more managed through dam infrastructure and flood mitigation works. But the seasonal patterns of that country still produce major flood events, as has been seen repeatedly in the last 2 decades. Every major flood in the Murray-Darling Basin uncovers things, objects, and sometimes human remains that have been buried in the sediment of previous events. The rivers hold their history in their banks the way all rivers do, in layers. Number 39. The language that was spoken for 50,000 years and nearly died in a single generation. At the time of British colonization in 1788, approximately 250 distinct language groups existed across the Australian continent. These were not dialects of a single Australian language. They were genuinely separate languages, with distinct grammars and vocabularies and phonological systems, many of them as different from each other as French is from Mandarin. The linguistic diversity of pre-colonial Australia was extraordinary by any world standard. By the middle of the 20th century, the majority of these languages had been lost or were in critical condition. The process of that loss, driven by colonial policies that actively prohibited the use of Aboriginal languages in schools and institutions, by the forced removal of children from their communities that disrupted the intergenerational transmission of language, and by the death of speakers in the violence and disease of the colonial period, was one of the most rapid and comprehensive episodes of language extinction in human history. A language that is not spoken is not simply a communication system that is lost. It is a knowledge system. The vocabulary of an Aboriginal Australian language encodes specific knowledge about the landscape in which it developed, about the plants and animals and weather and water and seasonal patterns of a particular country. Words that do not exist in English describe relationships between elements of the environment that English grammar cannot easily express. Ecological knowledge, medical knowledge, navigational knowledge, historical knowledge, all of it encoded in the structure of the language, in the vocabulary, in the grammatical relationships that express how things in the world relate to each other. When a language dies, that knowledge system is not simply translated into another language. It is lost because the concepts it contains do not exist in any other language in the same form. Some things can be approximately conveyed, others cannot be said in any language except the one in which they were originally understood. This is not metaphor. There are documented examples of Aboriginal Australian botanical and ecological knowledge that was recorded in language before the language's decline and that has subsequently been verified by Western science to be accurate and sophisticated. Knowledge about the medicinal properties of specific plants. Knowledge about the timing of seasonal events. Knowledge encoded in place names that describe geological features that have since been confirmed by survey. Knowledge that took tens of thousands of years to accumulate, and that was lost in a single generation in many cases. The mystery of what was lost with those languages is not fully resolvable, because the mechanism of its loss was also the mechanism of its destruction. We cannot know what we do not know that we do not know. The linguistic knowledge of 50,000 years of careful observation and accumulated understanding was, in many cases, spoken for the last time by individuals who died alone in institutions, or who were prevented from teaching their children, or who outlived the communities in which their knowledge had meaning. Language revival efforts are active across Australia. Communities working to recover and revitalize endangered and dormant languages have achieved remarkable results in some cases, recovering languages from recordings, from documentation by early anthropologists, from the memories of surviving elders, and rebuilding them into living practices. This work is ongoing and is one of the most important cultural projects in contemporary Australia. But the full record of what was known in the languages that were not recorded before they were lost is gone. And the mystery of its exact contents, the specific knowledge, the specific stories, the specific understanding of the world that those languages contained, is a mystery that cannot be solved. It can only be mourned and replaced imperfectly with what can be recovered and what can be rebuilt. Number 40, the Ice Age coastline and the footprints that prove everything. In 2023, a team of researchers working along the coastline of Western Australia in the region around the Murujuga National Park on the Burrup Peninsula documented one of the most significant paleontological discoveries in Australian history. Beneath the surface of the shallow coastal waters, on rock platforms that were exposed during lower sea level periods, they found human footprints, not fossils of footprints, not casts. Actual impressions left in rock that has hardened since the time the prints were made, preserving the shape of the feet, in some cases the toes, of human beings who walked across that surface when it was dry land. The Burrup Peninsula is already one of the most significant archaeological sites in the world. The rock art density on the Murujuga Formation, the largest collection of ancient rock art anywhere on the planet, with over 1 million individual engravings, means that the peninsula has been understood for some time as a place of extraordinary human antiquity and cultural continuity. The art spans tens of thousands of years and depicts animals, human figures, and abstract forms that document the changing ecology of the region over that period. The footprints add a new dimension. They are evidence not of cultural activity, but of physical human presence in a specific place at a specific time, in a location that is now underwater and that was dry land only during the last Ice Age period of lower sea levels. The dating of the footprints, still being refined, suggests they were made between approximately 12,000 and 100,000 years ago, when the sea levels were lower and the landscape the prints crossed was coastal plain. The people who made those footprints walked to the edge of what was then their coastline and left their marks in rock. The rock hardened around the impression. The sea rose over thousands of years and covered it. And now, tens of thousands of years later, researchers in the shallow water are finding the exact shape of the feet of those people, the size and weight distribution of their steps, the direction they were walking. There is something about this discovery that goes beyond its archaeological significance, which is already enormous. The footprints are the most intimate possible evidence of a human life, not a tool, not an artwork, not a structure. The shape of a foot, the mark of a body in motion, of a person walking toward the water on an ordinary day 60,000 years ago or more, leaving an impression that they had no way of knowing would survive. And that was preserved not by any deliberate act of preservation, but by the slow chemistry of the rock and the rising and falling of the sea. That is the mystery that opens outward as you look at it rather than closing. Not a puzzle to be solved, but an invitation to imagine. Who were they walking toward? What were they thinking? What did the water look like on that day, on that old shore, in that time before writing or history or any of the frameworks we use to understand what it means to be a person on the surface of the earth? They walked there, and the rock remembered. Number 41, the rogue wave that arrived without warning and what it left behind. On the 27th of December 1998, the Sydney to Hobart yacht race was underway in Bass Strait when a severe low-pressure system generated sea conditions that meteorologists later described as among the most dangerous ever recorded in Australian coastal waters. The storm produced waves measured at 25 meters from trough to crest, taller than an 8-story building. Rogue waves, individual waves of extraordinary height that arise suddenly and far exceed the surrounding sea state, were documented by multiple vessels. The outcome of that race is part of Australian maritime history. 6 sailors died, 5 yachts sank, 55 sailors were rescued, many from life rafts after their yachts had already gone down. Of the 115 yachts that had started the race, only 44 finished. The search and rescue operation that followed was the largest peacetime rescue in Australian history. The mystery embedded in the 1998 Sydney to Hobart disaster is the mystery of rogue waves themselves, which that event helped bring to the attention of oceanographic science. For most of the 20th century, the existence of rogue waves as a distinct and predictable phenomenon was not accepted by mainstream oceanography. Sailors reported them. Sailors had been reporting them since the earliest days of ocean sailing. These were waves of a height and suddenness that defied the statistical models used to predict sea states. The models said waves of the size being reported could not occur with the frequency they were reported. The models were wrong. Research following the 1998 disaster and a series of other wave events in the 1990s and 2000s confirmed that rogue waves, defined as waves more than twice the height of the surrounding sea state, occur far more frequently than the models predicted. Satellite surveys using radar altimetry confirmed that rogue waves in the open ocean occur at a rate of several events per day globally. They are not rare anomalies. They are a regular feature of ocean behavior that the existing models had failed to account for. What remains not fully resolved is the mechanism of formation. Why does a particular configuration of ocean swells, currents, and wind produce a rogue wave in one location and not another? The interaction between ocean current boundaries, particularly around the Agulhas Current off South Africa, which is the area with the highest documented density of rogue wave events, and the existing sea state has been studied. The same current interaction effects exist in the waters around Australia, particularly in Bass Strait and in the southern waters off the continent's east coast. The sailors who raced in 1998 were experienced. The yachts that sank were well built and properly crewed. The sea produced something that the models said should not exist in that form, and 6 people died in a storm that no forecast had fully predicted. The ocean around Australia is capable of producing conditions that the science of weather and sea state prediction has still not fully captured. The models are better now than they were in 1998. They will be better again in 20 years, and the sea will, in the meantime, continue to produce things the models have not yet anticipated. Number 42, the mine that swallowed a town and the residents who chose to stay underground. Broken Hill is a mining city in far western New South Wales, about 1,200 kilometres west of Sydney, in a stretch of arid country close to the South Australian border. It sits on top of one of the richest mineral deposits ever found, a body of lead, zinc and silver ore that has been continuously mined since 1883. The deposit, the Broken Hill ore body, is approximately 8 kilometers long and has been mined to depths of over 1,500 meters. The city above the mine has been shaped by the mine in ways that go beyond the economic. The social history of Broken Hill is the social history of the union movement in Australia, because the miners at Broken Hill were among the first and most militant organised workers in the country, and the agreements they fought for and won in the early 20th century became templates for labour relations across the entire Australian industry. The physical relationship between the city and the mine is also unique. Broken Hill has been subsiding. For decades, as the underground workings have been extended and deepened, sections of the city's surface have dropped as the rock below has been removed, and the overburden above the workings has settled. Buildings have cracked and in some cases been demolished. Streets have been realigned. The relationship between the solid surface and the hollow below is a constant negotiation. What is less known is the underground environment itself, which miners who work and have worked at Broken Hill describe in terms that suggest something more than an industrial space. The ore body itself is a geological formation of remarkable visual quality, the mineral crystals in some sections of the underground workings being among the most spectacular examples of natural mineralogy in the world. The underground environment at depth, with its specific combination of temperature and pressure and the peculiar acoustic qualities of a space inside millions of tons of rock, produces an experience that miners describe very differently from surface work. There is a reported tradition, going back to the early mining era, of certain areas within the Broken Hill underground workings being considered by miners as places to avoid. Not structurally dangerous areas, which are marked and managed differently, but specific locations that miners found uncomfortable in ways that they associated with the history of the mine rather than with geological hazard. The mine has a long history of accidents and deaths going back to the earliest years of operation, and the underground spaces where significant loss of life occurred are known to current workers through oral tradition. Whether there is any literal basis for the discomfort associated with those locations, or whether it is a form of memorial instinct that associates a place of death with an experience of presence, is not a question that underground mining culture typically attempts to resolve scientifically. Miners are pragmatic people. If something makes you feel wrong in a specific place, you note it and you maintain situational awareness, and you do not spend more time there than necessary. That is the relevant practical response regardless of the explanation. The mine continues to operate. The city continues to exist above it. The ore body beneath Broken Hill has produced more extracted wealth than most people can comfortably conceptualize, and it has been doing so for over 140 years without exhausting itself. The underground history of that place is one of the longest continuous industrial histories of any site in Australia, and it contains within it a record of human endeavor and human loss that the surface city, for all its own history, only partially reflects. Number 43. The cave, art that is older than human civilization anywhere else on Earth. The Murujuga rock art on the Burrup Peninsula of Western Australia, which was referenced in an earlier mystery, deserves its own attention. It is, by measure, the largest and most dense collection of ancient rock art anywhere on the planet. Over 1 million individual engravings on the granite and greenstone rocks of the peninsula, created over a period spanning at minimum 40,000 years and possibly much longer. That number, 1 million, is difficult to hold in the mind with the weight it deserves. 1 million individual acts of creation, separated by time spans measured in thousands of years, on the surface of rocks in a landscape that the creators moved through and lived within and understood with an intimacy that is essentially unimaginable from the outside. The engravings depict animals that are still present in the Australian landscape and animals that have been extinct for tens of thousands of years. Thylacines appear in the record, animals that may be extinct megafauna, creatures larger than any living Australian species, appear in forms that suggest the artists observed them directly rather than inherited their depictions. This means that some of the art on the Burrup Peninsula was created when the megafauna that it depicts were alive, which places some of the images at a minimum age of approximately 46,000 years, the approximate date of the megafauna extinction in Australia. It also depicts, in one of the most discussed series of images on the peninsula, what appear to be human figures with unusual characteristics. Figures with circular heads, figures with internal geometric patterns, figures that do not match the depictions of ordinary human beings in the same artistic tradition, but that appear to represent something different, something the artist considered significant enough to carve repeatedly over an extended period. What those figures represent is a question that the custodian communities of the Murujuga have their own interpretations of. Interpretations that are part of the living cultural tradition associated with the site and that are not always shared with outside researchers in their full form. The Western research tradition has produced various interpretations, ranging from depictions of shamanic or ceremonial states to suggestions of encounter with unusual phenomena, none of which is accepted universally. The Burrup Peninsula is under pressure from industrial development. The Murujuga National Park was established to protect the rock art, but industrial facilities including ammonia plants and other petrochemical infrastructure have been built in close proximity to the rock art sites, and acid emissions from industrial activity have been documented as causing surface damage to the engravings. The debate about how to balance the preservation of what may be the oldest intact artistic tradition on Earth with the economic development interests of the region is ongoing and is one of the most important cultural heritage disputes in contemporary Australia. The engravings will not last forever if the current conditions persist. The surface chemistry that is destroying them is not reversible. What is being lost, slowly and chemically, is not merely art. It is the longest continuous human record of a specific landscape anywhere on Earth, created over tens of thousands of years by people who understood that landscape with a depth and specificity that subsequent inhabitants have only begun to approximate. Number 44, the drought that came every century and what it did to everything. Australia is the driest inhabited continent on Earth. That is a fact of its geography and its climate and its position in the global weather system. The continent sits in a zone of atmospheric descent that inhibits rainfall over most of its interior, and the ocean currents that influence its climate produce a pattern of variability that is more extreme than any other comparable landmass. But the century-scale droughts, the megadroughts, are a different order of thing from the ordinary variability. Tree ring records, lake sediment cores, coral records, and speleothem data from caves have been used by paleoclimatologists to reconstruct the rainfall record of Australia going back thousands of years. What they reveal is a pattern of sustained droughts, lasting decades and in some cases over a century, that make the most severe droughts of the instrumental record, the Federation Drought of 1895 to 1903 and the Millennium Drought of 1997 to 2009, look relatively moderate. The mystery embedded in this climate record is the question of what happened to the human populations who lived through the mega droughts. Aboriginal Australian communities have inhabited this continent through multiple cycles of extreme climate over 65,000 years. The mega droughts that the proxy records document would have produced profound changes in the distribution of water and food resources across the continent. They would have required significant adaptation, probably including population movement, changes in subsistence strategies, and changes in the social and cultural frameworks that maintained community cohesion. The archaeological record contains hints of this adaptation. There are periods in the Australian archaeological record where evidence of human activity in certain regions becomes sparse or absent, consistent with population withdrawal from areas that had become inhospitable during drought conditions. There are other periods where the material culture record shows rapid innovation, consistent with communities adapting to changed conditions. The oral traditions of Aboriginal Australian communities contain stories that researchers have begun to read as climate records. Stories of times when the land was different, when certain water sources existed that no longer exist, when certain landscapes supported life that they no longer support. Some of these stories may describe conditions during the Holocene, the 10,000-year period since the last ice age. Some may describe conditions that are older. The full record of human response to Australian climate extremes over 65,000 years is contained in the sediment and the stone and the living oral tradition of the communities who survived it. Reading that record accurately requires collaboration between Western paleoclimate science and Aboriginal knowledge traditions in ways that Australian research institutions have been developing and that will produce a more complete picture over the coming decades. What that picture will reveal about resilience, about adaptation, about the specific knowledge systems that allowed communities to survive conditions that would eliminate most modern societies, is not yet fully known, but the outline is becoming visible, and it is, in every aspect of it, more impressive than the story of human presence in Australia that most people have been taught. Number 45, the reef that has been dying and the ancient record that proves it has died before. The Great Barrier Reef is the largest coral reef system on Earth. It extends for over 2,300 kilometers along the northeast coast of Queensland. It is composed of approximately 3,000 individual reefs and 900 islands. It supports an extraordinary range of marine life. It is one of the 7 natural wonders of the world, one of the most visited natural environments in Australia, and one of the most studied ecosystems anywhere on the planet. It is also dying. That is not a position. It is a documented scientific observation. Mass coral bleaching events caused by elevated sea temperatures that cause corals to expel the symbiotic algae that give them their color and sustenance have occurred with increasing frequency since the first recorded major bleaching in 1998. The bleaching events of 2016, 2017, 2020, and 2022 were the most severe on record, affecting the northern sections of the reef most dramatically. In 2016 alone, approximately 30% of the reef's coral cover died as a direct result of bleaching. The mystery embedded in the reef's history is the discovery, through core drilling of reef limestone and analysis of the resulting records, that the Great Barrier Reef has died before, not locally, not partially, entirely. The current reef structure, the one that exists today, is approximately 8,000 years old. The reef that preceded it died approximately 12,000 years ago during the rapid sea level rise that followed the end of the last ice age. There was no Great Barrier Reef during the peak of the last ice age. The platform of rock and coral rubble on which the current reef has grown was above sea level, part of the exposed continental shelf. When the seas rose, the reef began to re-establish itself on the old platform. The reef that is under threat today is, in geological terms, quite young. This history does not make the current crisis less serious. The reef that is dying now is the reef that exists now, the one that millions of fish and other organisms depend on, the one that protects the Queensland coastline from storm surge, the one that generates billions of dollars of economic activity through tourism and fishing. The fact that reefs can re-establish over thousands of years is cold comfort to the organisms, including the human communities whose economies and cultures are built around the reef, that cannot wait thousands of years. But the geological history does add a layer of perspective to the mystery of the reef's future. The question is not whether coral reef ecosystems can survive the changes coming to the ocean. The geological record demonstrates clearly that they can. The question is whether this specific reef, in this specific configuration, supporting this specific suite of species and this specific human relationship to the ocean, can survive intact across the timescale that matters to the organisms living within and around it now. The answer that the science currently provides is that it cannot survive intact if sea temperatures continue to rise at the current rate. The answer that the geological record provides is that reef ecosystems over geological time are remarkably resilient. Those two answers are simultaneously true, and holding both of them at once is the emotional and intellectual challenge that the Great Barrier Reef presents to anyone who looks at it honestly. The reef is beautiful. The reef is also a record, in its limestone core, of every climate event it has survived and not survived over the entire Holocene. Reading that record carefully tells you more about the future than almost any other source of data available, because it is the accumulated experience of an ecosystem meeting exactly the kind of challenge it is now meeting again. The difference this time is the speed of change and the presence of a species capable of either accelerating or decelerating what is happening to it. Number 46, the storm of fire that nobody predicted and the survivors who remembered. On the 7th of February 2009, a Saturday in high summer, a series of fires swept through the bushland and farmland of Victoria under conditions that generated a firestorm of a kind that Victorian communities had not experienced since Ash Wednesday in 1983, and which some researchers believe was without precise precedent in the recorded history of the state. The fires of what became known as Black Saturday killed 173 people. Hundreds of homes were destroyed. Entire communities were obliterated in minutes. The town of Marysville was essentially destroyed, with the fire burning through it in a matter of minutes, far faster than any evacuation could have been completed after the fire front became visible. Kinglake, Flowerdale, Narberthong, St Andrews, Strathewen, communities across the ranges north of Melbourne, were hit in sequence by fire fronts of extraordinary intensity. The conditions that day were documented before the fire started. The temperature in Melbourne reached 46.4 degrees Celsius, the highest ever recorded in the city. The relative humidity dropped to single figures in some locations. The wind was strong and shifting. Fire weather forecasters had identified the day as one of extreme fire danger, and warnings had been issued. The Bushfire Cooperative Research Centre had described conditions as approaching the worst possible within the known range of fire weather. And yet, the intensity of what happened exceeded even those warnings. The fires produced their own weather systems. Pyrocumulus clouds, massive anvil-shaped storm clouds generated by the intense heat of the fires themselves, developed above the most intense burn areas and produced their own wind patterns, carrying burning material far ahead of the main front and starting new fires in locations that were not yet threatened. Witnesses described burning debris landing kilometers ahead of the fire front. The mystery embedded in Black Saturday is not the cause of the fires, which was a combination of exceptional weather conditions and, in some cases, arson or accidental ignition. The mystery is the question of whether this kind of event was always possible within the range of Australian fire weather, or whether it represents something new, a crossing of a threshold produced by decades of changing climate conditions that have made the worst possible fire days worse than the worst days that existed before. The survivors of Black Saturday carry the experience in ways that they have articulated in various testimonial records collected by researchers and by the Royal Commission that followed the event. Their accounts describe a particular quality of the experience, the speed of it, the totality of it, the sense of something that was not just a large fire, but a different order of phenomenon entirely. Several survivors describe moments of complete disorientation, of the environment around them becoming something unrecognizable, of the normal rules of what fire does and how it moves simply not applying. The Royal Commission produced recommendations that change fire management and community safety policy across Australia. The lessons of Black Saturday have been applied. The country is better prepared for extreme fire events than it was before the 7th of February 2009. And the conditions that made that day possible are still present in the climate system, present and intensifying, which means that the mystery of what fire can do in this particular country under the worst possible conditions is not a mystery that has been resolved. It has been witnessed and studied and prepared for. It has not been prevented. Number 47, the last speaker and the language that went with her. There was a woman named Dolly Napangadi who was the last fluent speaker of the Warlpiri Creole language variant spoken in her community. There was a man named Hector Burton who died in 1987 as the last speaker of Mbabaram, a language of the Atherton tablelands in Queensland, whose vocabulary was so different from surrounding languages that when it was first studied by linguists, they initially assumed the language family of origin was entirely distinct from other Australian languages. There was a woman named Amy Nyanjalpai, whose death in 2018 made the Ngadi language critically endangered, with no fully fluent speakers remaining. These are individual stories from a pattern that has played out across Australia since colonisation. The death of languages with their last speakers, the closing of windows onto ways of understanding the world that took tens of thousands of years to construct and were destroyed in a generation or two of active suppression. The language loss is also a knowledge loss. This is not a metaphor. The specific knowledge encoded in the vocabulary and grammar of Australian Aboriginal languages, ecological knowledge, medical knowledge, astronomical knowledge, historical knowledge, navigational knowledge, knowledge about the behavior of animals and the properties of plants and the seasonal cycles of specific landscapes. This knowledge was embedded in the languages and was transmitted through the languages. And when the languages died, the knowledge died with them to whatever extent it had not been recorded or transmitted to surviving speakers. The mystery of what was in those languages is not fully resolvable for the languages that died without adequate documentation. Linguists working in Australia from the 19th century onward produced records of varying quality and completeness, and some of these records have become the primary material through which communities are now attempting to revive and reclaim their languages. The quality of a 19th century missionary's transcription of a language he may have spent only months studying is not always sufficient for full reconstruction. But there is another kind of mystery here that is less often discussed. The mystery of why it was allowed to happen, not in the sense of moral mystery, which is not mysterious. The colonial project required the suppression of existing cultural systems as part of its program of land acquisition and social control. The mystery is the scale of the loss relative to the effort that was made and was not made to prevent it. Australia in the 20th century had universities with linguistics departments. It had anthropologists and ethnographers working in the field. It had government agencies with the capacity to fund documentation projects. The intellectual and institutional infrastructure to preserve these languages, if not to prevent the social conditions of their decline, existed. The resources that were applied to that preservation were inadequate by any assessment. The languages that remain, the 200 or more that are still spoken to some degree by communities in Australia, are the subject of revival and maintenance efforts that in many cases represent extraordinary community commitment and scholarly collaboration. The results are genuinely hopeful in some cases. Children are learning languages that were spoken only by elderly people a generation ago. Songs are being sung again in words that had not been heard for decades. The mystery of what was lost cannot be solved. But the mystery of what can still be saved is one that is being actively answered, one family, one school, one community gathering at a time. And that answer is worth more than any certainty about the past can provide. Number 48. The stars over the outback and the navigation system that was old before written history. Aboriginal Australians developed one of the most sophisticated astronomical knowledge systems ever created by any human culture. This is a statement that most people who have not spent time with this subject will find surprising, because the conventional narrative of astronomical history focuses on the ancient Near East, on Babylonian and Egyptian and Greek traditions, as the origins of systematic sky knowledge. But the Australian astronomical tradition is older than any of these by thousands of years, and it is different in its fundamental orientation in a way that reveals something important about the relationship between culture and science. Western astronomical tradition focuses primarily on the stars, on the bright points of light in the night sky that form constellations and mark the positions of planets and provide navigational reference. Aboriginal Australian astronomical tradition focuses equally on the dark spaces between the stars. The dark nebulae, the clouds of dust and gas that appear as black patches in the Milky Way, are used to define constellations. The emu in the sky, one of the most famous of the dark constellation figures, is defined by the dark patches that outline the shape of an emu, rather than by a pattern of bright stars. This is not merely a different aesthetic choice. The dark constellations are connected to ecological knowledge in ways that the bright constellations are not. The position of the emu's head over the eastern horizon in the evening sky coincides with the period when female emus are nesting and the eggs are accessible. The position of the emu constellation at different times of year marks different stages of the emu's seasonal cycle, providing a practical calendar for people who depended on emu eggs and emu for food. Similar connections between stellar positions, the positions of specific stars and constellations, and ecological events have been documented for dozens of species and dozens of seasonal phenomena across multiple Aboriginal language groups. The flowering of specific plants, the arrival of specific fish, the spawning periods of marine species, all connected to specific astronomical markers that allow the astronomical calendar to function as a practical ecological calendar. The precision of these connections, documented by ethnobotanists and ethnoastronomers working with Aboriginal communities, is not approximate. They are specific enough that Western ecological science, which measures these same seasonal phenomena instrumentally, finds the astronomical markers to be accurate predictors. The stars that mark the flowering of a specific plant do correspond to the plant's actual flowering period across the landscape where the tradition was developed. This system was built over tens of thousands of years of observation and transmission. The night sky over the Australian outback, far from any light pollution, is one of the most spectacular in the world. The Milky Way so bright and distinct that its dust clouds are visible to the naked eye in a way that is genuinely astonishing to people who have spent their lives under artificially lit skies. It is a sky that rewards sustained attention and rewards it across generations. The mystery of the Australian astronomical tradition is that it was developed in parallel with and independently of every other great astronomical tradition in human history, and arrived at its own sophisticated conclusions using methods and frameworks that are distinctive rather than derivative. It is a scientific tradition that operated for longer than any other currently documented, without instruments beyond careful observation, and without writing beyond the transmission of knowledge through story and song. And it still works. The flowering times and the nesting seasons and the spawning periods that the tradition predicts can still be verified by going to the landscape and looking at what is happening there. The stars are still in the same positions relative to the same events. The system is not broken. It has simply been inaccessible for most of the last 2 centuries. To most of the people who live in the country it was designed to serve. That is changing. Slowly, and with the complexity that all genuine cultural exchange requires, it is changing, and the stars are still there, waiting. Number 49. The radioactive bomb part that was lost in the outback and found 30 years later. On a property in the Western Australian outback near the town of Newman, in January 2023, a small capsule was reported missing from a transport vehicle operated by Rio Tinto, one of the world's largest mining companies. The capsule was a measurement device, a density gauge used in mining operations, and containing a small quantity of radioactive cesium-137 in a glass capsule inside a metal housing roughly the size and shape of a finger. The capsule had been transported from a mine site to Perth on the back of a truck, and had apparently vibrated loose from its container during the 1,400-kilometre journey. It was somewhere on the Newman to Perth highway, or somewhere near it, in approximately 1,400 kilometres of remote Western Australian landscape. The response was immediate and, by any assessment, proportionate to the risk. The radioactive material in the capsule, while not sufficient to cause immediate death, emits gamma radiation at a level that could cause radiation sickness with extended close proximity, and that poses a significant health risk to anyone who found it without knowing what it was. Western Australian authorities issued public warnings. A search operation was organised. Finding a finger-sized object somewhere in 1,400 kilometres of open highway and surrounding scrub, using radiation detection equipment from a moving vehicle, is precisely as difficult as it sounds. The detection equipment had to be moving slowly enough for the detectors to register the capsule's low-level emissions, meaning the search vehicle was crawling along the highway while normal traffic moved around it. The capsule was found. 9 days after it was reported missing, searchers located it on the roadside, approximately 2 kilometres from the small town of Newman, having apparently fallen from the truck early in the journey. It was recovered safely, and nobody was injured by it. The mystery here is not the loss or the recovery. The mystery is the 9 days in between, during which an object containing radioactive material was lying on the side of a remote highway, where anyone, a child exploring the roadside, a road worker, a truckie checking their load, could have picked it up. The probability of someone encountering it in that roadside position, given the traffic that travels that highway daily, was real rather than negligible. Western Australia's outback highway network is the circulatory system of a mining economy that extracts enormous wealth from the interior. Material moves along those roads that most people travelling them know nothing about. The Kimberley, the Pilbara, the Goldfields region. These parts of Australia operate on a scale of industrial activity that is essentially invisible to most Australians, who see only the quarterly mining export figures and not the physical reality of what moves across the land to produce them. The cesium capsule sat on the roadside for 9 days and was found by people with equipment rather than by a curious traveller. That is the good outcome. The question of what else moves along those roads. What other measurements of industrial risk have been made, and how those measurements translate into the day-to-day reality of the people who live and work in those corridors, is a question that the 9 days of that capsule sitting on the roadside makes vivid in a way that abstract risk assessments do not. Number 50. The ghost ship and the crew of 30 that simply was not there. In January of 2007, the Australian cargo vessel Kaz II was found drifting without power approximately 80 nautical miles off the coast of Queensland near Airlie Beach. The vessel had failed to make contact as scheduled, and a search had been launched. When rescuers from an AMSA Challenger jet located the boat, it appeared intact and undamaged, no visible signs of distress. No life raft deployed, no flares fired. When they boarded the vessel, they found it completely empty. The Kaz II was a 12-meter catamaran, and its normal crew was 3 men, brothers Derek and Peter Batten and their friend Des Batten. The men were experienced sailors. The vessel had been sailing from Airlie Beach to Port Douglas, a journey of several hundred kilometers up the coast, and had failed to report as expected. On the vessel, rescuers found the engine running, a meal half prepared in the galley, 3 life jackets stowed below deck, a laptop computer operating. The sails set, though at an angle suggesting the vessel had not been under full control for some time. Everything consistent with a functioning vessel that had simply had its crew removed. The state of the vessel was inconsistent with panic or emergency. The life jackets being below deck rather than worn, or at least on deck, suggested either that the situation that caused the crew to leave had been very sudden, or that the crew had not perceived themselves to be in danger when they left the boat. The meal in the galley suggested the situation had arisen quickly during routine activity. Queensland authorities investigated. The most accepted explanation is that one of the 3 men went overboard, perhaps to check something on the outside of the vessel, and the other 2 went in after him or were swept in trying to rescue him, and none of them were able to reboard the vessel. The conditions in the area at the time were rough, with winds up to 25 knots producing swells large enough to make reboarding a moving vessel extremely difficult or impossible. In those conditions, 3 men in the water, while the vessel moved away under its own momentum, could account for the scene as found. This explanation is plausible and is the one that authorities settled on. The bodies of all 3 men were found in the weeks following the discovery of the vessel, in a pattern consistent with having entered the water at a location consistent with where the Kaz II had been. The deaths were recorded as accidental drowning, but the specific configuration of the scene aboard the vessel, the running engine, the half-prepared meal, the set sails, has never been fully mapped onto a precise sequence of events that accounts for everything found. How exactly 3 experienced sailors came to be in the water with the vessel continuing to sail away from them, without any of them managing to radio a distress call or trigger the EPIRB emergency beacon that was aboard, remains unexplained in its specific detail. The Kaz II returned to the ocean. The 3 men it had contained went with it in a different way. The sea off Queensland is warm and blue and busy with tourist vessels on clear days. It contains, in its uncommunicative way, the answer to exactly what happened on that catamaran in early 2007. It has not offered to share it. Number 51. The migration pattern that should be impossible and has been doing it for millions of years. Every year, across the Australian continent and its surrounding oceans, migrations take place on a scale that should be impossible by the caloric mathematics of the journey, but that nonetheless happen, reliably, year after year, generation after generation, as they have been happening since before the continent was in its current position on the globe. The humpback whales that travel the full length of the Australian east and west coasts between their Antarctic feeding grounds and their tropical breeding areas cover 12,000 kilometers round trip. They do this without eating during much of the journey, fueled entirely by the blubber reserves they build in Antarctic waters over the summer. The caloric accounting of this migration, the energy required to move an animal of that size, that distance without refueling, is at the outer limit of what biological computation would suggest is feasible. And yet, they do it. They have been doing it for millions of years. The loggerhead turtles that hatch on beaches in Queensland and Western Australia navigate to feeding grounds in the Pacific and Indian Oceans, using the Earth's magnetic field, and spend years at sea before returning to lay their own eggs on the same beaches where they hatched. The precision of this navigation, the capacity to identify a specific beach among the thousands of kilometers of Australian coastline by reading the geomagnetic signature of that particular location, is a form of perception and memory that science has documented but not fully explained. The mechanism by which a turtle hatched on a Queensland beach can find that exact beach 20 years later, after a decade of open ocean, is understood in broad outline but not in the precise sensory detail that would constitute a complete explanation. The bogong moths of southeastern Australia migrate from the interior plains to the alpine regions of the Australian Alps every spring to estivate in the cool granite caves of the high country and then return to the lowlands in autumn. Their navigation uses a combination of the Earth's magnetic field and stellar cues, a system of extreme sophistication for an insect with a brain the size of a small grain of rice. The Adnyamathanha and other Aboriginal peoples of the region, where the moths summer have traditionally travelled to the mountains to harvest them in large quantities. The moths are high in fat and protein and were a significant seasonal food source. The human migration to the mountains tracked the insect migration with precision. What these migrations have in common, and what makes them mysterious in the most productive sense, is that they demonstrate capacities, navigation, memory, endurance that do not fit easily into the framework of what we think of as animal cognition. The whale that swims 12,000 kilometers without eating is not doing something that our models of animal physiology would predict as optimal. The turtle that finds its birth beach 20 years later is not doing something that our models of memory and perception in small-brained reptiles would predict is possible. The moth that navigates to specific alpine caves using the stars is not doing something that our models of insect neurology would predict is achievable. They do it anyway. They have always done it. And the mystery they present is the mystery of capability that has not yet been fully explained, rather than capability that has not been fully documented. The documentation is extensive, the explanation is incomplete, which is, when you think about it, one of the most interesting possible positions for a mystery to be in. Number 52, the wreck below the wreck and the layers of Australian maritime history. The waters around the Australian coastline contain the physical record of over 500 years of European maritime activity and a much longer record of the movement of Austronesian and other peoples through the region. The number of documented shipwrecks in Australian waters runs to over 10,000. The number of undocumented and undiscovered wrecks is estimated to be considerably higher. The density and diversity of this underwater heritage creates what archaeologists call site formation complexity, situations where multiple events have occurred in the same location over time and have produced layered evidence that is difficult to disentangle without extremely careful and well-resourced investigation. Several locations in Australian waters are known or suspected to contain multiple wreck events in the same geographic area. The reef systems of the Coral Sea, the shipping approaches to major ports, and the treacherous passages between islands in the Torres Strait have accumulated wreck events across centuries. Some of these sites contain material from different periods of maritime history, layered in ways that can only be understood by examining the stratigraphy of the seabed with the same care that land archaeologists apply to excavation sites. One category of wreck that is attracting increasing attention is the pre-European contact wreck. If Portuguese or other European navigators reached the Australian coast before the Dutch and English contacts that are in the formal record, as some researchers argue, and if any of those earlier vessels were lost on the Australian coast, the physical remains of those vessels would be in the seabed somewhere along the Australian coastline. The mahogany ship in the dunes near Warrnambool is the most discussed example of a suspected early European contact wreck, but it is not the only candidate. Reports of unusual wreck material in various coastal locations have accumulated in the historical literature over 2 centuries. Some of these reports have been investigated. Others have not. The resources available for underwater archaeological survey of Australian coastal waters are limited relative to the scale of the task. The seafloor archaeology of Australia is one of the most exciting frontiers in Australian heritage research. Every major storm event that shifts the seabed sediment in a wreck area can expose new material. Every technological improvement in underwater survey equipment increases the resolution with which known sites can be examined. Every year, the picture of what is down there becomes slightly more complete. And somewhere in that incompleteness, in the tens of thousands of square kilometers of Australian seabed that has not yet been systematically surveyed, the physical evidence that would settle some of the most persistent questions in Australian maritime history is sitting in the dark and the cold and the weight of the sea, waiting for someone with the right equipment and the right funding and the right moment of weather to find it. The sea is patient, the wrecks are patient. Australia is a patient country. Number 53, the community that survived in isolation for 40 years and the world it created. In the early years of the 20th century, a small community of Danish immigrants established a settlement in the remote bushland of South Australia, south of Port Augusta, in a region of mallee scrub and harsh limestone country that most Australians had considered uninhabitable. They called their settlement Steinfeld. They arrived with little capital and considerable determination and began farming in conditions that would have discouraged most settlers. What makes the Steinfeld community remarkable is not its founding, but its subsequent history. Separated from the nearest substantial town by distances that were, in the pre-motor vehicle era, significant barriers to regular contact, the community developed a degree of cultural and social self-sufficiency that was unusual even by the standards of isolated rural Australia. German was the primary language, maintained across generations by families that had limited contact with English-speaking Australia for extended periods. The Lutheran Church at the center of the community maintained religious and social practices that had largely disappeared in Denmark itself by the time the community was well established. The effect of this isolation on community identity, on language, on cultural practice, and on the kinds of knowledge that were preserved and the kinds that were lost is a small-scale version of the same process that occurred across many immigrant communities in rural Australia. The isolation that was initially forced by geography became, in some cases, chosen, as communities found that their difference from the surrounding Australian culture was also a source of cohesion and identity. The linguistic record of these isolated communities is one of the most interesting in Australian sociolinguistics. Languages maintained in isolation from their source culture develop in specific ways, preserving forms that have changed in the origin country, and developing new vocabulary for the specific conditions of the new environment. The German spoken in South Australian immigrant communities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries contained elements that had already disappeared from Standard German in Germany. This process of isolation and development is a mystery of identity and continuity. What makes a community what it is over time, in the absence of the surrounding culture that originally formed it? What is preserved and what is shed when a group of people are placed in conditions of geographical and cultural isolation? The communities that formed in remote Australian farmland across the 19th century, Norwegian, German, Italian, Greek, Lebanese, Chinese, each of them created a specific answer to these questions, and each of those answers is part of what Australia is. The mystery of Australian identity, the question of what a country built from successive waves of people and movement becomes, is not one that has been answered. It is still being answered in every suburb and every rural community, where people are negotiating the relationship between where they come from and where they are, between the languages they brought and the language they found, between the stories that were told them and the stories they are making. That negotiation is the most persistent and the most ordinary mystery Australia contains. It is happening right now in every direction, and it will not be finished for a very long time. Number 54. The ozone hole and the Australian scientists who told the world first. In the 1970s, atmospheric chemists working on the chemistry of the stratosphere began to understand that chlorofluorocarbon compounds, CFCs, used widely in refrigeration and aerosol propellants, were capable of destroying the ozone molecules in the stratosphere that protect the Earth's surface from ultraviolet radiation. The theoretical work was primarily American, produced by researchers including Mario Molina and Frank Sherwood Rowland, who would eventually share a Nobel Prize for this discovery. But the confirmation of the ozone hole, the actual measurement of significant ozone depletion over Antarctica, came from researchers working in and around Australia. The British Antarctic Survey team that published the first measurements of the Antarctic ozone hole in 1985, and the subsequent CSIRO and Australian Antarctic Division researchers, who contributed to mapping and understanding the phenomenon, were working in the part of the world where the hole was largest and the consequences for human populations most severe. Australia is one of the countries most directly affected by the Antarctic ozone hole. The thinning of the ozone layer over the southern hemisphere, including over much of Australia, significantly increased ultraviolet radiation reaching the surface during the period of most severe depletion. Australia's rate of skin cancer is the highest in the world. The relationship between UV exposure, fair-skinned populations, and the thinning ozone layer is a direct contributor to a public health burden that costs Australian society billions of dollars annually. The mystery here is not scientific. The ozone chemistry is well understood, and the Montreal Protocol of 1987, which phased out the production of ozone-depleting substances, is one of the most successful international environmental agreements ever implemented. The ozone hole is recovering slowly and is projected to return to pre-1980 levels sometime in the middle of this century. The mystery is a societal one. How does a society learn to change its behavior in response to an invisible, delayed action, globally caused threat? The ozone story is the model case for this question, because the response worked. The science was communicated, the policy response was implemented, and the trend reversed. The parallel to other environmental challenges is obvious and has been extensively discussed. What is less often recognized is the specific role of Australian geography in making this problem visible. The hole over Antarctica and its consequences for the southern hemisphere were a direct function of the atmospheric chemistry of polar stratospheric clouds and the specific conditions of southern hemisphere weather patterns. If the comparable depletion had occurred primarily over the Arctic, where the conditions are slightly different and the consequences fall over a more sparsely populated region, the political pressure to act might have been slower to build. Australia's position, directly in the path of the ozone hole's influence, and the research capacity of Australian atmospheric science, place this country at the center of one of the most significant environmental discoveries of the 20th century. That is a mystery of geography as much as anything else. The place where the evidence was most visible determined, in part, the urgency of the response, and the urgency of the response determined the outcome. Location is everything, in Australia as everywhere else. But in Australia, where the continent is the southernmost inhabited landmass and the Antarctic is next door, location has a specific quality of consequence that other places do not quite manage. Number 55, the city that was built for a capital and the arguments that have never quite ended. Canberra exists because Melbourne and Sydney could not agree. In the late 19th century, when the Australian colonies were negotiating the terms of federation that would produce the Commonwealth of Australia in 1901, Melbourne and Sydney were the two dominant cities, and they were rivals in the comprehensive way that early colonial cities are rivals when there are only two of them. Both cities wanted to be the capital of the new nation. Neither would accept the other as capital. The compromise that was eventually reached was to build a new capital somewhere between the two cities, in territory that would be excised from New South Wales and governed federally. A site in the Monaro region of New South Wales was selected after extensive survey. An international architectural competition was held. The winning design was submitted by Walter Burley Griffin and Marion Mahoney Griffin, an American architectural couple from Chicago whose design was influenced by the City Beautiful movement and by the specific topography of the chosen site. Canberra is a planned city in a way that no other Australian city is, because it was designed from scratch by architects working from a blank topographic survey, rather than growing organically from a colonial settlement or a port. Its road patterns follow geometrical principles derived from the Griffin design. Its institutions, the Parliament, the High Court, the major museums and galleries, are positioned in deliberate relationship to each other and to the surrounding landscape. The lake at its center, Lake Burley Griffin, was a Griffin design element, an artificial lake created by damming the Molonglo River that transforms the valley topography the city sits in. The mystery of Canberra is not a conventional mystery. No one has disappeared there unexplainedly. No lights have appeared over it that cannot be explained. No strange objects have been found in its streets. The mystery of Canberra is the mystery of a place that was designed to be a symbol, and that has spent over a century negotiating the gap between what it was designed to be and what it actually became. It was designed to be a national capital that would inspire pride and unity. It became a city that many Australians from other states regard with mild suspicion and occasional affection, associated with bureaucracy and politicians, and the particular quality of political weather that generates from the proximity of so many government institutions. It was designed to be beautiful, and it is beautiful in the specific way that planned cities can be beautiful when the design is good. The lake, the bush-covered hills, the deliberately proportioned spaces between buildings, the quality of light in the high cold winters and the hot dry summers. It is, by any objective aesthetic assessment, one of the more handsome capital cities in the world, and it sits in the middle of the country it governs, connected to the two cities that created it by highways and a railway, housing the institutions that make national decisions, producing the political weather that blows across the continent, in a location that was chosen specifically because it belonged to neither of the cities whose rivalry created it. Whether it has succeeded in becoming what it was designed to be is a question that Australians argue about regularly. The argument is part of what Canberra is, and the fact that it is still being argued more than 120 years after Federation and more than 100 years after the city was founded suggests that the question of what Australia's capital should be is more complex than the architectural competition that selected it anticipated. That is perhaps the most distinctively Australian political mystery of all. Not who did it, not where it came from, not what it means, but whether it is working and who gets to decide. Number 56. The volcano under the city that Australians forgot about. Melbourne sits on the edge of one of the most extensive volcanic provinces in Australia. The Western Plains volcanic province of Victoria extends from the current city outward to the west and northwest, covering an area of approximately 23,000 square kilometers, and it contains over 400 individual volcanic centers, most of them extinct and eroded to gentle hills and crater lakes that are now popular scenic drives and recreational destinations. The most recent eruption in this province occurred approximately 8,000 years ago at Mount Eccles in southwestern Victoria. That is geologically very recent. 8,000 years ago is within the human occupation period of this region. It is within the period when Aboriginal Australians were living in this country, and indeed the geological evidence of the Mount Eccles eruption has been correlated with Aboriginal oral traditions from the Gunditjmara people that describe a time of fire from the ground and a changed landscape. The Budge Bim landscape, of which Mount Eccles is part, is one of the most significant cultural landscapes in Australia. The Gunditjmara people used the lava flows from ancient volcanic activity to create a sophisticated system of channels and weirs for eel aquaculture, one of the oldest known examples of systematic aquaculture anywhere in the world. This system is approximately 6,600 years old and was in continuous use until the colonial period. It was listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2019. The volcanic history of southeastern Australia is therefore not merely a geological curiosity. It is the history of a landscape that has been actively shaped by geological processes within the human occupation period, that has been understood and responded to and worked with by the people who have lived on it across those thousands of years, and that contains within its rock record the evidence of events that the oral traditions of those people have preserved. The mystery of the Western Plains volcanic province is the mystery of dormancy. A dormant volcano is not an extinct one. The distinction is important and is not always clearly communicated to the people who live in proximity to dormant volcanic provinces. The geophysical conditions that produce the eruptions of the Western Plains province have not fundamentally changed. The plate tectonic setting that underlies this kind of intraplate volcanism is still active. The question of whether the province will erupt again is a question about timing rather than possibility. And the answer that geologists currently offer is that the timing's unpredictable, but the possibility is real. The city of Melbourne has grown to a population of approximately 5 million people in the years since European settlement. It has grown in the direction of the volcanic province, with suburbs extending into the areas of young volcanic rock west and northwest of the city centre. The volcanic heritage sites of the region, Organ Pipes National Park, the Yuyangs, the Hanging Rock, the Crater Lakes of the Western District, are day trip destinations that Melburnians visit on weekends to enjoy the particular beauty that this kind of landscape produces. Almost none of them are thinking about the volcano. Almost none of them know that the pleasant green crater lake they are walking around the rim of last erupted within the human memory of the people who have been in this country for 65,000 years. The geological record and the oral tradition both say that the ground here has opened before, within living memory on the scale that the Gunditjmara count living memory, which is the scale of deep time. The ground is patient. The ground is also, on geological timescales, not finished. Number 57. The color of the sky and the Aboriginal artists who painted it. Before anyone understood why, in the bark, paintings and ground paintings and rock art of Aboriginal Australian artists across the continent, a particular color appears with a frequency and intentionality that researchers have been studying for several decades. The color is a specific yellow ochre, derived from iron oxide minerals found in particular locations across the continent, that appears in artistic contexts associated with specific ceremonial and cosmological meanings that are not fully shared with outside researchers. This color, and the question of where it comes from and what it means, led a team of researchers in the late 2000s to examine the geological sources of the ochre minerals used in Aboriginal Australian pigments with a level of precision that had not previously been applied. What they found was that the specific geochemical signature of ochre used in artworks at specific sites could be matched to specific mineral deposits, allowing the provenance of the ochre to be traced. The results were extraordinary. Ochre from specific mineral deposits was being transported hundreds, and in some cases thousands of kilometers from its source to the sites where it was used. Transport routes could be mapped by following the geochemical signatures. These routes corresponded, in multiple cases, to the songlines and dreaming tracks documented by anthropologists, the ceremonial routes that connect sites across the continent in the living geography of Aboriginal cosmology. This is a concrete physical geochemical demonstration that the songlines are not merely mythological or cosmological constructs. They are also, or perhaps primarily, practical routes of material and cultural exchange across the continent, routes that have been in use for tens of thousands of years, and that are still known to the communities whose heritage they are. The mystery of the ochre routes and the songlines they correspond to is a mystery of function. Why are these specific routes used? What is the logic of a network that connects mineral deposits to ceremonial sites across thousands of kilometers of varied terrain? The answer is that the logic is the same logic that underlies all human exchange networks. It moves value from where it is concentrated to where it is needed, and it does so along routes that have been refined over generations to be efficient and reliable. The songlines are, among other things, an infrastructure system, a knowledge transmission system, a resource management system, a social network maintained through regular ceremonial exchange. The cosmological dimension, the fact that these routes are understood by the communities that maintain them as pathways along which the creative ancestors of the dreaming traveled, and in doing so shape the landscape, does not contradict their practical function. It reinforces it by embedding the practical knowledge of the roots in a framework that ensures its transmission and its protection across time. The color of the ochre in the paintings is specific because the mineral source is specific. The mineral source is specific because the routes that connect sources to sites are specific. The routes are specific because they were established over tens of thousands of years of movement across the continent. And the movement was maintained because the people who walked those routes understood that maintaining them was maintaining the world. That is not a mystery in the sense of something unknown. It is a mystery in the sense of something the full depth of which cannot be reached from the outside. The closer you look at it, the more it contains. And the more it contains, the more clearly you can see that the categories you brought with you to examine it are not quite the right size for what you are looking at. Number 58. The night the lights of an entire town went out and nothing in the sky made sense. On the evening of the 21st of March, 2010, in the town of Westall in suburban Melbourne, a group of residents reported something in the sky above the southeastern suburbs that generated police reports and local media coverage, and then, in the way of many Australian unexplained events, settled into the file of things that happened and were not resolved. But this is not a 2010 story. This is the second time something happened at Westall. The first time was on the 6th of April, 1986. Westall is a suburb in Melbourne's southeast, a quiet residential area of low-set houses and local schools and the kind of ordinary suburban geography that makes the events of April 1966 all the more remarkable in retrospect. On that April morning, approximately 200 students and teachers at Westall High School and a neighbouring primary school witnessed a metallic disc-shaped object descend into a grassed area adjacent to the school grounds, remain for a few minutes, and then rise and depart at speed. 200 witnesses, students and teachers, in plain view, in broad daylight, in the middle of an ordinary Melbourne morning. The event lasted long enough for groups of students to run toward the object before it departed. Several students who reached the landing area later described flattened grass in a circular pattern, consistent with an object having rested on the surface, similar in character to the Tully saucer nest that occurred 3 months later in Queensland. What followed is what makes the Westall case unusual even within the substantial Australian record of unexplained aerial phenomena. School staff reportedly instructed students not to discuss what they had seen. A man identified by some witnesses as wearing some form of official identification arrived at the school and spoke with the principal. Several students who had reached the landing area said they were told to stop talking about what they had seen. Whether these accounts of official suppression are accurate in their details cannot be confirmed without access to records that have not been released. What is confirmed is that formal inquiries through Australian Freedom of Information processes have produced very limited material about any official investigation of the Westall event. For an event with 200 witnesses in an urban setting, the official paper trail is remarkably thin. The witnesses of the 1966 Westall event have spoken about it at length in the decades since. Many of them gathered at a reunion in 2010 that generated significant local media coverage. They are consistent in their accounts, adjusted for the normal variation in individual perception and memory across 44 years. They saw what they saw, and what they saw has not been explained by any official account. What was it? The honest answer is not known, In terms of physical phenomena that could produce the described observations in an urban setting in daylight, the range of possibilities is not large. Experimental aircraft of some kind remains a possibility, which would account for the apparent official interest, though no specific aircraft type has been identified that matches the described characteristics. The landing, if it occurred, and the flattened grass reported by students who reached the site is more difficult to account for with a conventional aerial explanation. The residents of Westall went back to their ordinary days after the 6th of April, 1966. The suburb continued to be a quiet residential area. Children continued to attend the school, and the morning when 200 people watched something they could not identify land in the paddock next to the classroom was absorbed into the accumulated strangeness that Australia carries in its history. Noted and filed and not quite explained, sitting in the record waiting for someone to look at it with the right question. Number 59. The man who walked into the Blue Mountains and the world he found there. The Blue Mountains west of Sydney are the first significant landscape feature that European settlers encountered when they tried to move beyond the coastal plain of New South Wales in the early years of colonisation. They blocked westward expansion for 25 years. The mountains are not, by global standards, very tall. They reach barely 1,000 metres at their highest points, but they are deeply cut by gorges covered in dense eucalyptus forest, and their blue haze, produced by fine droplets of eucalyptus oil in the air that scatter light in the blue spectrum, gives them an atmosphere that is both beautiful and disorienting. In 1813, the explorers Blaxland, Lawson, and Wentworth crossed the Blue Mountains by following the ridgelines rather than attempting to descend into the gorges as earlier expeditions had done. This route opened the interior. The cattle and sheep country of the inland plains became accessible. The expansion of the colony accelerated. But the Blue Mountains kept people, not in the way that the ocean or the desert keeps people, as simple loss. The mountains have a history of people who went in and found something that changed them, or that changed what they believed about what a landscape could contain. The Wollemi pine is the most famous example. In 1994, a national parks officer named David Noble abseiled into a remote gorge in the Wollemi National Park, a vast wilderness area to the north of the Blue Mountains proper, and found a grove of trees he did not recognize. He brought back samples. Analysis confirmed that the trees were a species believed to have been extinct for approximately 2 million years. A conifer with a fossil record going back 200 million years, related to trees that grew when Australia was part of the Gondwana supercontinent, alive in a gorge in New South Wales, surviving in a population of fewer than 100 mature trees. The location of the Wollemi Pine Grove is one of the most closely protected secrets in Australian conservation. The coordinates have not been publicly released. The gorge is inaccessible without specialized climbing equipment and official permission. A small number of researchers have visited the site under strict protocols. The trees have been successfully propagated in cultivation and are now available commercially, meaning the species is no longer threatened with extinction. But the original wild grove, the last remnant population of a living fossil tree, is still there in its unreleased gorge, in the silence of the sandstone country. A tree that has been growing in the same gorge for 2 million years does not experience mystery in the same way that we do. It simply continues. The mystery is ours. The mystery of a world that is much larger and much older than the familiar version of it that we move through in our daily lives, and that contains within the apparently ordinary, within the landscape visible from the train between Sydney and Lithgow, within the blue haze that gives the mountains their name, a living remnant of a world that existed before humans were here to see it. The gorges of the Blue Mountains are not fully mapped. The Wollemi National Park is not fully explored. The specific conditions that allowed a grove of 2-million-year-old trees to survive in one gorge, while the rest of the species disappeared from the record, are not fully understood. And what else might be surviving in the gorges that are difficult to access is a question that the discovery of the Wollemi pine makes it impossible to dismiss as fanciful. The mountains are still blue in the afternoon, the oil is still in the air, and the gorges are still keeping what they keep. Number 60. The dead heart and the water beneath it that nobody expected. The interior of Australia is often called the dead heart, a phrase that captures both the geographical reality of the vast arid interior and a particular colonial attitude toward a landscape that does not support European-style agriculture and does not look like the English countryside. It is a phrase that contains within it a profound misunderstanding of what the landscape actually contains. Beneath the dead heart, beneath the red sand and the gibber plains and the salt lakes and the dry creek beds of the Australian interior, is one of the largest reserves of groundwater on the planet. The Great Artesian Basin underlies approximately 22% of the Australian continent, covering an area of over 2 million square kilometres across Queensland, New South Wales, South Australia, and the Northern Territory. It contains an estimated 64,000 cubic kilometres of water. That number is large enough to require a moment. 64,000 cubic kilometres of water. If that volume were placed on the surface of the continent, it would cover the entire landmass of Australia to a depth of approximately 8 metres. It is the largest and deepest artesian basin in the world. The water in the Great Artesian Basin is old. The oldest water currently being accessed from the basin fell as rain on the margins of the basin approximately 2 million years ago. It percolated through the permeable sandstone layers that form the basin's aquifer and has been moving very slowly through the rock for 2 million years. When a bore is sunk into the basin and the water rises under its own artesian pressure, which it does in many parts of the basin because the recharge areas at the basin margins are higher than the discharge points, the water that emerges has been underground for a very long time. This water is what has made the interior of Australia habitable in ways that its surface appearance does not suggest. Aboriginal Australians knew about the groundwater and the spring systems it produces at the surface. The mound springs of South Australia, where artesian water comes to the surface through fissures in the rock and creates permanent water sources in otherwise arid country, were important sites in the movement of people across the interior. They are associated with significant cultural and sacred traditions and with ecological diversity, because the reliable water supports ecosystems that do not exist elsewhere in the surrounding arid country. European pastoralists discovered the basin in the 1870s and developed it rapidly for stock watering. By the early 20th century, thousands of bores had been sunk, many of them flowing without any means of stopping the flow. The uncontrolled loss of artesian water from flowing bores for decades significantly reduced the pressure in the basin and reduced or eliminated many of the natural spring systems that Aboriginal communities and the ecosystems they supported had depended on. The mystery of the Great Artesian Basin is the mystery of a resource that was invisible until it was found, and then immediately began to be depleted at a rate that the 2 million year recharge cycle cannot match. The water being used from the basin today fell as rain 2 million years ago. It is not being replaced on any timescale that human management can address. It is, functionally, a finite resource, a reservoir of ancient water that accumulated over geological time and is being drawn down by modern extraction. The reckoning of what this means for the communities and ecosystems that depend on it, and for the broader question of how a continent manages the gap between its visible and its invisible resources, is ongoing. The basin still underlies the interior. The water is still there in enormous quantities that will outlast any individual human lifetime. But the direction of the trend, the long-term trajectory of pressure and flow and availability, is one that the geological patience of the basin and the human impatience of the extraction rate are navigating in ways that the next century will make clearer. The dead heart is not dead. It never was. It is full of water that is 2 million years old, and it is producing on its surface the questions that come from not understanding what a landscape contains until after you have already begun to change it. Number 61. The night sky record and what it means that the universe looked different then. The square kilometre array, under construction across sites in outback Western Australia and South Africa, will be the largest radio telescope ever built when it reaches completion. The Australian component, centred on the Murchison Radio Astronomy Observatory in remote Western Australia, consists of thousands of individual antenna stations spread across vast distances of flat, extremely radio-quiet desert, chosen specifically because it is among the most electromagnetically quiet environments accessible to large-scale scientific infrastructure anywhere on the planet. The purpose of this instrument, and the purpose of its predecessors already operating in the same region, including the Australian Square Kilometre Array Pathfinder, is to listen to the radio frequencies emitted by hydrogen atoms across the universe, and through those emissions to map the distribution of matter in the universe across cosmic time, looking back toward the earliest periods of the universe's existence to understand how galaxies and large-scale structure formed. In doing so, it will be answering some of the oldest and most fundamental questions in physics, questions about the nature of dark matter and dark energy, questions about the formation of the first stars, questions about the distribution and evolution of galaxies across the 14 billion year history of the universe. And it will be doing this from the same landscape, the same red dirt outback country of Western Australia, where Aboriginal Australians have been making their own observations of the sky for 65,000 years. The Yamaji and Badimia peoples, whose country the observatory is on, have astronomical traditions and sky knowledge developed across thousands of generations in the same electromagnetic silence that makes the location valuable to modern radio astronomy. They watched the same sky, they asked some of the same questions. They developed answers in a different framework, encoded in different language, serving different purposes, but addressing the same fundamental human desire to understand the relationship between the patch of ground beneath their feet and the immensity of what is above them. The Square Kilometre Array's indigenous engagement process is one of the more serious examples of the attempt to bring these parallel knowledge traditions into productive relationship. The project involves formal agreements with traditional owner groups and ongoing consultation about cultural heritage in the observatory footprint. It does not pretend that 65,000 years of sky knowledge is equivalent to modern astrophysics in terms of answering specific technical questions about the hydrogen line. It also does not pretend that modern astrophysics is the only framework through which the sky can be understood. The mystery that this instrument will eventually address is the mystery of the universe's early history. What it will find is not yet known, because it has not yet been built and pointed at the sky at its full capacity. The answers will change what we know about where everything came from. They will come from the most radio-quiet desert on Earth, in a country that has been listening to the sky for longer than any other people in human history, and they will be produced by an instrument that is itself a kind of extraordinary collaboration between the accumulated knowledge of modern physics and the specific qualities of a specific place. The red dirt of the Murchison will be the same red dirt it has always been. The sky above it will be the same sky. And the answers that come from pointing the largest ear ever built at that sky, in that silence, in that ancient country, will be the newest things ever known in a place where almost everything is very old. That is the last mystery, not because there are no more, but because it points in the right direction, outward into the unknown, with instruments made of knowledge and curiosity, and the very Australian characteristic of choosing the most remote and most difficult place to ask the most important questions. Number 50. The question at the end of all the questions. We have spent a long time together tonight in the company of disappearances and mysteries and things that the record does not fully explain. We have followed pilots into the sky and not come back down with them. We have stood at the edge of beaches where children walked away from their parents' world. We have looked at rocks that someone carved in a desert in 1998 and did not sign. We have listened to languages being spoken for the last time and to the silence afterward. We have watched footprints appear in the underwater rock of a drowned coastline and tried to imagine the feet that made them. And now we are at the last one, number 50, the question at the end of all the questions. Here it is. Australia is the oldest continent. Its rocks are among the oldest on Earth. Its human history is the longest continuous human history anywhere. Its natural history is separated by so many millions of years of isolation from the rest of the world's fauna and flora that it evolved in a completely different direction, producing animals and plants and ecosystems that exist nowhere else. Developed in response to the specific pressures of this specific piece of the planet over a span of time that the human mind cannot hold with the weight it deserves. And within this oldest continent, with this longest human history, with this deepest ecological record, with this most isolated and therefore most distinctive natural heritage, the stories of mystery are still accumulating. New disappearances are added to the record every year. New unexplained phenomena are reported. New archaeological discoveries are made that revise what we thought we knew. New DNA analysis reopens cases that were considered closed. New satellite imagery reveals geoglyphs and formations that were invisible from the ground. New instruments are deployed in the ocean and in the atmosphere and in the soil, and they find things that the existing frameworks do not fully accommodate. The mystery of Australia is not solved. It is not solving at a rate that suggests it will be solved in the near future. It is a country that has been producing questions longer than most of the rest of the world has been thinking about questions, and it has not run out of them. What does that mean? What do we do with a place that is simultaneously the most ancient and the most incompletely understood, that is simultaneously right in front of us and genuinely beyond what we have yet been able to fully know? I think it means that the posture of certainty is not available here. This is a country that punishes the certain. It punished Burke and Wills for their certainty. It punished the colonial project for its certainty that the land was empty and the people were without value. It punished the forensic scientists of 1982 who were certain about the evidence against Lindy Chamberlain. It punishes anyone who arrives at the edge of the Australian interior and thinks they understand what they are looking at. The appropriate posture for Australia as a subject is the one that the best of its researchers and its storytellers and its traditional knowledge holders share. Curiosity without conclusion, attention without assumption, the willingness to keep looking long after a satisfying answer has failed to appear. That is harder than certainty. It requires staying in the uncomfortable space between the question and the answer for as long as the evidence demands, which in this country is often a very long time. But it is also more honest. And in a country this large and this old and this strange and this beautiful, honest is the only thing worth being. The mysteries are there. They have always been there. And the fact that they have not been solved yet does not mean they cannot be. It means we have not looked long enough yet, or listened carefully enough yet, or asked the right people in the right way yet. We have time. The continent has been there for 4 billion years. It is patient in a way that nothing human-made ever manages to be. It will wait for us to catch up. Keep looking. The Grange Jetty sounds. There is a jetty that extends into the water at Grange, a quiet suburb on the coast of South Australia, north of Adelaide. It is not a famous jetty. It is not particularly long. It is the kind of structure that exists in hundreds of small coastal communities around Australia. Weathered timber over calm water, the kind of place where children fish on school holidays, and old men sit in the early morning without particular urgency. There is nothing about the Grange Jetty that would suggest it belongs in a list of Australia's mysteries, except for the sounds. Beginning sometime in the 1990s and continuing with varying intensity into the present, residents in the area around Grange began reporting a low-frequency hum, not a loud sound, not an intrusive sound, something closer to the sound of a large engine idling at extreme distance, or a note played on an instrument lower than any instrument is supposed to go. The kind of sound that you feel in your chest before you consciously register hearing it. The kind of sound that is difficult to locate because it seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The reports were consistent enough and specific enough that researchers began paying attention. The sound was not constant. It came and went. It was stronger at night. It was stronger in winter. Multiple independent witnesses in the same area on the same night described the same thing without having spoken to each other first. This is a phenomenon that has parallels around the world. The Bristol hum in England, the Taos hum in New Mexico, the Windsor hum near the Canada-US border, which was eventually traced to emissions from a blast furnace on Zug Island in Michigan. The existence of low-frequency environmental hums is not in itself controversial. What is controversial is the source of the Australian version, and why only some people can hear it. Studies in multiple countries have established that the percentage of the population sensitive to low-frequency environmental hum is small. Estimates range from 2 to 4%. The experience for those who can hear it is not pleasant. Chronic exposure to low-level infrasound has been linked in some studies to sleep disruption, anxiety, difficulty concentrating, and a pervasive sense of unease that the affected person often struggles to explain to those around them who hear nothing at all. This creates its own particular frustration. The person who can hear the hum sounds to the person who cannot, like someone describing a ghost. The ghost is real to the person experiencing it. To everyone else, the room is empty and quiet. In the Grange area, theories have ranged from industrial sources north of the city to shipping traffic in the Gulf of St. Vincent to geological activity, to something related to the area's underwater topography. None of these has been conclusively demonstrated to account for all the reported characteristics of the sound, including its intermittent nature, its seasonal variation, and the specific area within which it appears to be strongest. What makes this more interesting than a simple noise complaint is what it illustrates about the nature of perception and evidence. The Grange hum, like its counterparts elsewhere, sits in a category of experience that is simultaneously undeniable to those who have it and essentially unverifiable from the outside. Multiple credible witnesses, consistent descriptions, no identified source. The structure of a mystery without the drama. There are researchers who believe that low-frequency hums like this one are being generated by microseismic activity in the ocean floor, a constant low-level vibration produced by waves interacting with continental shelves that travels through rock and water and soil and surfaces in certain locations at certain times under certain atmospheric conditions. The ocean making a sound too low for most people to hear, but not apparently for all. If that is the explanation, it is a remarkable one. It would mean that a small percentage of the population is, without knowing it, picking up the sound of the Earth itself, not a metaphor. A literal acoustic signal generated by geological and oceanic processes operating at scales and time scales that dwarf anything human. the body is instrument, the nervous system is receiver. The quiet suburb of Grange is one of the places where the planet's low voice surfaces into the range of human experience. That has not been proven for the Grange hump specifically. It remains, at the time of this script, unexplained. But it belongs here, in this list, not because it is the most dramatic mystery on the list, but because it is one of the most personal. The person lying awake at Grange, hearing the sound that no one else in the house can hear, is having an experience that is real and verified and unresolved. That is what a mystery is, not always a body on a beach or a pilot disappearing mid-sentence. Sometimes it is a sound just below the threshold of most people's hearing, coming from somewhere beneath the water, at 3 in the morning, in a quiet suburb that has no particular reason to be strange, and yet it is. There is a broader point here that the Grange hum makes quietly, without insisting. Australia is not only mysterious at its dramatic edges, it is not only mysterious in its deserts and its disappearances and its coded messages left in the pockets of unidentified men on empty beaches. It is mysterious in its ordinary places too, in its suburbs built on coastal shelf over water that has been there for millions of years, in the geological processes that continue beneath streets and gardens and jetties, indifferent to the lives happening above them, in the architecture of human perception, which turns out to be tuned to frequencies that most of us never consciously register, picking up signals from the planet itself without knowing that is what is happening. The mystery is not always elsewhere. It is not always in the past. Sometimes it is directly beneath your feet, or just below the threshold of what you can consciously name, present in a suburb you would not look twice at on a map, being heard by a small percentage of the population who cannot explain what they are hearing, but are absolutely certain they are hearing something. That too is Australia. That too belongs here. And that is where we are tonight. 50 mysteries, 50 questions. Some of them with partial answers, some of them with answers that generate new questions, and some of them with no answer in sight, the kind of question that sits in the desert at night and looks up at the stars with no particular urgency because it knows that time is on its side. Thank you for being here tonight. Genuinely, wherever you are in the world right now, if you are in Australia, this is your country, and I hope some of what we covered tonight feels new or unexpected. If you are somewhere else, I hope this gave you the sense of a place that is much stranger and much older, and much more rewarding to pay attention to than the postcodes and kangaroos summary suggests. If you want to keep exploring, leave a comment with which mystery is sitting with you the most. Tell me which one you are going to be thinking about. Tell me which one you want to go deeper on. The Somerton Man, the Beaumont Children, the footprints on the drowned coastline, the languages that went with our last speakers, the emu in the sky, whichever one it is, tell me. And if you're not subscribed yet, now is the time. More of this is coming. There is a lot more of this country to cover, and we are not going to rush it. The desert is patient. We can be patient too. Sleep well wherever you are, and watch the sky. And if you happen to live somewhere quiet, near water, at the edge of a continental shelf that has been accumulating geological history for longer than the word history applies to anything human, and you hear something low and distant in the early hours of the morning that no one else in the house can hear, you are not imagining it. You are just tuned to a frequency most people miss. That is not a problem. That is a gift. Pay attention to it. Good night.